Yeah, okay, so the long and short of it is I forgot to check my schedule before going to sleep, and I did not set any alarms to wake me up to record stuff for Slime, so I had to reschedule that. That's why we're 10 minutes late, and because of that, I have 3 hours to get through 4 chapters, so we're just gonna move through it. No preamble, none of that shit. We're just gonna go. So, yeah, that's basically it. Yeah. All right. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into... Really? Come on, man. All right. I cannot believe I had so much stuff up here. Okay, getting rid of that really helped. Dropped the, Well, I'm not going to speed run. No, if I speed ran this, it'd be a whole different thing, and you wouldn't get any decent acting out of it to begin with, so it'd be less impactful. No, we're not going to skip exercises tonight. No. I can't do that. I finally dropped down to a permanent 214, so we need to keep that going. That's actually doing good. I mean, my eating habits and how much they've changed have really helped. Sorry. Wow, that yawning. Have really helped, so... That felt good. Also, there's a lot of natural veggies around here that I think we're going to do something with. From my aunt and uncle's garden. Yes! Oh, all the exercises that got turned in last night, like, I did 50 crunches, and while I was doing 50 crunches, 4 crunches got redeemed. So yeah, everything that was done last night is being ignored. So I'm just getting rid of all that stuff. Okay, everything except the squats that were just redeemed. There we go. All right, good. So from this moment, only the squats that were just redeemed count. I got rid of everything else. So those are the only things that were redeemed. But we'll keep doing our normal thing. So yeah, I have about 3 hours to get through 4 chapters. Let's see if I can do this. Chapter 5, Parental Dignity. Before I knew it, 3 more months had slipped past. It was summer now. Snow had melted completely, and we'd landed in the middle of a hot, dry stretch. So far, I'd spent most of this year mooning over Lucy. Whenever I had a little spare time, I'd use it to look at her. She was my first and only child, after all. It was only natural for me to adore her. On this day, like many others, I was hanging around in her bedroom, watching her quietly. Whenever I gazed down on that angelic, chubby-cheeked little face, it put a big, goofy grin on mine. However, I was technically the head of this household now. I didn't exactly exude authority, but I did want to act in a relatively dignified fashion around my wives and sisters. If I spent too much time cooing over my baby like an idiot, their opinion of me would surely be affected. For this reason, I intended to be a stern father. You know, tough but fair, that sort of thing. If I knew Paul, he'd probably had similar thoughts looking down on me as a baby. A father should inspire awe in his children. He should be an example to them and a goal for them to reach. At one point, I'd thought of Paul as pitiful, or even pathetic. But by now, I knew better. He'd been a magnificent father. He had his flaws, and plenty of them, but he was wonderful nonetheless. To be sure, he wasn't the most faithful husband out there, but I didn't have much right to criticize him on that point. It was better to focus on the positives. At this point, I could say with confidence that I wanted to follow in my father's... Uh-oh, she's fussing again. I didn't have Sylphie to rely on today, so I had to step up to the plate myself. Here we go, Lucy. It's your daddy. Yeah. Oh, Lord, she's so cute. Is there anything in the world as adorable as this baby's smile? My wife somehow gave birth to a little angel by mistake. There's no other explanation for this. I got a little sidetracked there for a moment. Let's go back to the stern and dignified thing. The way I saw it, the ideal father was close enough to his children to be caring, but distant enough to guide them forward. Normally, he should be kind and gentle with his kids. When necessary, however, he shouldn't hesitate to give them a firm scolding. And when they really need his support, he should always step up to the plate for them. That was the ideal father as I saw it. Good luck with that. Everybody's ideal whatever that they have in their hand. Oh, wow. All the gift subs. Beyblader, thank you. No, it's good that you did it here. That's pretty dope. That's freaking awesome. Are the... Oh, that's why I didn't hear it. I didn't hear it because I had that turned off. That's so weird. Okay. Sorry, the alerts were turned off, and that's why I didn't hear it. Otherwise, I would have said something sooner. Look at all those Nyantas in the chat. Thank you guys so much. All right. But yeah, usually the ideal that we have of how we want to be, you'd be surprised how high of a bar that is, even if you think it's something so simple. I don't know where this is coming from because I'm not actually a parent and I haven't raised any children. But I think the idea that you hold up as like what you want to be, like honestly, I feel like when it comes to trying to be something for other people, you're more reactionary than you think, and it's a lot of the times it's just best to just try and hold on and see. Okay. So yeah. I'm gonna close Discord out real quick and then move on. Sorry about that, guys. I had to check a thing. If it got any earlier, I'd have to stop the stream and then start it back up with a part 2. I mean, that may still be how it goes, but, yeah. Okay. Let's see. It's sort of sounded like I was just describing my impressions of Paul. Was he my idea of a perfect dad then? I didn't want my children thinking of me as pathetic, to be honest. Good luck. You can't determine how other people think of you. But then again, it was partially Paul's weaknesses that endeared me to him. There were lots of lessons I could learn from his example. Also, though he might have looked pitiful to me sometimes, he had always been a wonderful dad to Norn. That much was obvious considering how much she'd adored him. In that case, maybe love and compassion was the most important. Oh no, she's getting worked back up again. Oh, Lucy, Daddy's back. I'm gonna pick you up, okay? Here we go. Yeah. As soon as I picked Lucy up out of her cradle and began to rock her back and forth, she started cackling loudly. Judging from her cherubic smile on her face, she liked being cradled in my big, strong arms. My heart couldn't take much more of this cuteness. Rudius? Yes, Suzanne? As I comforted Lucy, her wet nurse Suzanne had spoken up from across the room. Suzanne was a retired adventurer and an old friend of mine. I don't mind soothing the little lady when she fusses, you know. It's part of the job. Appreciate the offer, but I'd like to keep these blissful moments to myself. Thank you very much. The two of us had gotten to know each other back when I was just starting off as a solo adventure. We'd fallen out of contact for about 4 years, but then she'd seen my posting for the wet nurse job. It had been a real shock seeing her again. Huh. Well, if you really want to do it yourself, feel free. Is there any man in the world who doesn't want to soothe their newborn daughter? Can't say my husband's too eager to deal with it. How shameful. Sounds like he needs an education in the joys of fatherhood. I remembered the time I spent with Suzanne very clearly. I'd been only 12 years old, newly dumped by Eris and making my way to the Northern Territories alone. Feeling extremely sorry for myself, words cannot describe how miserable it made me to have the... It made me to have to dissolve our old party, Dead End, at the Guild in Bosharent. As a way of distancing myself from my feelings, I immediately tried to take on an extremely difficult and dangerous task all by myself. That was when Suzanne and her party had stepped in. Their group had 2 warriors, 1 archer, 1 healer, and a mage. They were a B-rank party, but all of them were experienced veterans. Suzanne was one of the frontline warriors. To be honest, she wasn't that impressive a swordswoman or anything. In terms of combat skill, she was closer to the bottom of rank B than the top. However, she had a reputation for kindness, and she knew how to keep a party running smoothly. When she noticed me trying to take a suicide mission, she walked right over and said something like, "How about we do that job together?" I protested that I was trying to make a name for myself as a solo adventure, but she argued that I needed to work with people to build a reputation. In the end, I let her talk me into working together. At the time, Suzanne was alarmed by just how rough I looked. My eyes were dull and lifeless, and she could tell I wasn't sleeping much at all. When I spoke to her in a carefully polite tone, she found it creepy rather than reassuring. Nonetheless, she took me in and helped me out. Until the day I left that first city behind, her party took me along on all sorts of quests. They even invited me to join them on a permanent basis. I ended up rejecting that offer, but they were always friendly to me when we bumped into each other. Sometimes they'd even pull me into a tavern for a meal. Looking back on it now, it was obvious they were looking out for me in all sorts of ways. I was grateful to all of them. After we went our separate ways, Suzanne had married Timothy, the mage and leader of their party. They'd moved back here together since Sharia happened to be Timothy's hometown. They had 2 kids together. Unfortunately, their third had been born prematurely and died soon after. Oh, yeah, Beyblade. There you go. Yeah, you can grab it on Kindle. You can find it on Bookwalker. There's lots of places where you can grab it digitally. If you'd prefer. I will say with Mushoku Tensei, it is preferable if you want to read... If you want to read it as soon as possible, it is preferable to grab the digital version because the digital release is a month early from the physical copies. So, case in point, toward the back half of this month, actually back half, we're almost at the middle of it. So, not very long from now, volume 17 is going to drop of Mushoku Tensei digitally, but you have to wait until next month for the physical copies. So it's up to you as to how you want to do it. But yeah, that's how I do it. I'm reading it on Kindle right now. So if you want to read directly along with me, we are on page 123. Yeah, dude. That's where we're at. Sorry. Alrighty. Suzanne's body was still producing milk despite the death of her child, so she decided to sell her services as a wet nurse. She'd been looking through the job postings when she happened to see my name. Incidentally, I'd stopped by to say hello to Timothy just a few days earlier. The man hadn't changed a bit. Gotta say, though, you sure have changed. Have I? Yeah, back in the old days, you never would have insulted a woman's husband in front of her. This was true. When I first met Suzanne, I was terrified of upsetting people. I still didn't want to offend anyone if I could possibly avoid it, but I guess I wasn't walking on eggshells these days. A lot of things had happened since then. Sorry, Suzanne. Did I upset you? Nah, a little teasing never hurt anyone, you know? As long as you're saying it to my face, it's all good. Makes me more comfortable, if anything. It probably had something to do with the friends I'd made at the university. I had more people I could talk to casually these days. Man, you can tell my sinuses are kicking my butt. My voice sounds different. Yeah, I can't wait for 17 to come out either. Zanoba and Cliff both preferred it that way, and it was easier for me as well. Hell, you could stand to be a little more casual around me in general, Suzanne continued. You're technically my employer, you know. I suppose so, but that's no reason to treat you impolitely. Suzanne rolled her eyes at that. Whatever you say, kid. I owed Suzanne a lot. At the end of the day, she was the one who taught me the ropes of adventuring in the Northern Territories. I couldn't bring myself to be too casual with her. Well, I guess it's all good with me as long as I get my paycheck. Of course, I'll tip handsomely, I assure you. The woman talked like it was all about the money, but she'd been wonderful so far. Wonderful? Man. Wonderful. I'd been a little nervous at first since I remembered some horror stories about sadistic babysitters from my previous life. But Suzanne was so tender with Lucy that you'd never know she wasn't her mother. Of course, we did have Lilia and Aisha hanging around the house to keep an eye on things, and I knew from the start she wasn't the kind of person who'd mistreat a child. How are your sons doing, by the way? Ah, the boys are a real handful, as always. They're running Grandma and Grandpa ragged. Suzanne and Timothy were living with Timothy's parents at the moment. It was the only reason she was able to work full-time as a wet nurse with 2 toddlers running around the house. She regularly complained to Lilia about how tough it was to be living under the same roof as her mother-in-law. Lilia was probably more inclined to identify with the mother-in-law, but I guess she was about Suzanne's age. It seemed like they got along. I saw them drinking tea together every once in a while. I've been wondering, did you want a boy first, too? Not really. Why would I? Well, you know, everybody wants an heir, right? Ah, sure. I'd had a few discussions like this after my daughter was born. Zanoba and Ariel had both brought it up as well. It was obviously an important issue to royal families and noble houses. Back in Asura, I'd even heard stories of newborn boys being whisked away from distant relatives for adoption by the main Boreas family. The thing is, though, I'm not really a noble or a wealthy businessman. It doesn't really bother me either way. I just want to see my kid grow up happy. If anything, I was pleased to have received the cuter option. I was seriously outnumbered in this house, true, but I can't say I minded being surrounded by adorable girls and charming women. It wasn't like they were bullying me either. They were almost too nice. Hey, that's the spirit. Wish my husband would take a page out of your book. The moment I got pregnant, he was talking about all the stuff he wanted to do if it turned out to be a boy. Didn't spare a minute's thought for the alternative. Well, you got your boys in the end, so I guess it turned out all right. Yeah, I guess. I've got some mixed feelings about it, though. The third one was a girl, you know. Ah, right. Sorry, that was a dumb thing to say. For an instant, I found myself wondering how I would have felt if Lucy had been stillborn. Just the thought of it was horrible enough. It's fine. We'll just try again. Yeah. Suzanne seemed almost nonchalant about it, though. Was losing a baby really something you could shrug off like that? At the very least, I knew I would have taken it hard. It wasn't easy for Sylphie to get pregnant, so there was no telling how long it would take for us to get another shot. And more importantly, Sylphie would have been devastated. It was easy to picture her crying her eyes out and apologizing to me for losing our child. God, just thinking about this was making my stomach hurt. There wasn't any point in dwelling on it, right? Lucy had come out fine, and Sylphie was okay too. Enough time had passed that I felt relatively confident it wasn't just a dream. Rather than thinking about how things could have gone wrong, I should be enjoying my good fortune. So anyway, I'm assuming you guys dissolved your party at some point, right? Yeah, not long after you left town. When you're as mediocre as we were, it gets pretty tough when you lose a core party member, you know? Patrice said he was going back to Asura to become a soldier, and we sort of fell apart on the spot. Do you know what happened to Sarah? You curious? Yeah, a little. Sarah was the name of an archer who'd belonged to Suzanne's party. It was rare for an adventurer to rely on a bow and arrows. But she had a real talent for landing timely, accurate shots in battle, which made her quite effective at her role. We were relatively close in age, and she'd been openly hostile to me at first, but over time, we'd gotten increasingly friendly. I like how we're revisiting Volume 7 in a happier light, even though it is my least favorite book of this series. In the end, our budding relationship imploded thanks to my performance issues. But I was still a bit interested in how she was doing now. Well, she's still out there making a living as an adventurer. You don't see many archers around since it's a lot easier to learn how to fling a fireball. but she's got the skills and experience now. She'll be just fine anywhere she goes. Ah, okay. Sorry, guys, I don't know what's up with my sinuses right now. If there's anything you left unsaid, you should probably go find her sooner rather than later. Never know when an adventurer might get themselves killed. I don't think that's really necessary. Our little fling was in the past now. Finding her to talk about it wasn't going to do me any good. It was hard to imagine that Sarah would enjoy remembering that whole mess either. Well, if you say so. Suddenly, Suzanne's eyes flicked away from me and toward the door. When I turned around, I saw Zenith standing there quietly. Lilia was lurking just behind her. Mom? Zenith made no reply, of course, but Lilia nodded. Pardon the intrusion, Master Rudius. Her eyes a bit unfocused, Zenith slowly stepped forward, then sat down next to me, positioning herself so she could get a good look at Lucy's face. Don't worry, Mom. Lucy's doing just fine today. This got no reaction whatsoever. Zenith just stared at the baby so intently she seemed to have forgotten anyone else was even in the room. After her arrival at my house, I felt like she'd become noticeably more active. When Norn was around, she tried to feed her at the dinner table. When she spotted Aisha, they'd go out to the garden and pull weeds together. And when I was watching Lucy, she'd stop by like this to check in on us. There were subtle differences in how she reacted to Roxy and Sylphie, too. Her facial expressions never seemed to change, and she still hadn't spoken a word, but she was moving. She was changing. Maybe she was inching her way back to something like a recovery. Kaga! Zenith had reached out her hands. Smiling from ear to ear, Lucy grabbed at them playfully. Aw, little Lucy sure does love her grandma, doesn't she? At first, I'd been nervous about this. Zenith's symptoms were comparable to something like dementia. I worried she might harm Lucy for no reason at all, without even meaning to. By this point, though, it was obvious that we had nothing to worry about. All she ever did was watch Lucy quietly. I'd never gotten a hint of negative emotion from her. If anything, she seemed like a normal woman gazing peacefully down at her grandchild. I felt a bit guilty for having doubted her in the first place. It wasn't like she'd ever gotten violent with anyone before. In some level, it seemed like Lucy understood that she meant well, too. The kid was all smiles whenever Zenith visited. It was honestly pretty heartwarming. Let's see. And there nope, that's not it. There we go. There we go. That shows it off. Cute little fat baby Lucy. But of course, there was a lot we didn't know about Zenith's condition and how it might develop. It was hard to imagine anything bad coming from these visits, but given how much was still uncertain, it was probably best for them to stay supervised. After all, accidents can happen, even when your intentions are good. Suddenly, Zenith looked up at me. It almost looked like she was trying to send me a message with her eyes. Not that I had any idea what she might mean, what it might mean. Wah! Wah! Seconds later, Lucy started fussing loudly. Pardon me, Miss Zenith. Lilia reached down and gently took Lucy away from me and Zenith. Suzanne came over, received the baby. She started soothing her while simultaneously checking her diaper and looking for rashes. After a moment, though, she nodded. Looks like somebody's hungry. Was it that time already? Sylphie had breastfed her before leaving, but somehow a couple hours must have slipped by since then, huh? Well then, I guess I'll step out of the room. I don't mind if you watch, you know. It was kind of Suzanne to offer, but I declined politely. We were old friends and all, but that didn't make it okay for me to see the breast of a married woman. She was just as well endowed as Zenith or Lilia, too. They actually seemed a little bigger than before. Maybe it was all the milk in there. I got a glimpse of those things. The wise old hermit inside me might be roused from his slumber. Oh, if I got it. If I got a glimpse of those things, the wise old hermit inside me might rouse from his slumber. That in itself might not be such a big deal, but what if Lilia, say, were to mention it to the others? Sylphie and Roxy might be disheartened. It was an undeniable fact that they were more on the flat chest side of the spectrum. But I didn't choose women based on their bodies. I didn't want them feeling self-conscious about it. In any case, was it just me or had Zenith noticed that Lucy was ready to be fed? Maybe you pick up a sixth sense for that kind of thing after raising 3 children of your own. Uh-huh. I walked out into the hallway and glanced through the nearest window. Unfortunately, it was gray and rainy day. It was hard to guess exactly what the time might be, but since Lucy had gotten hungry, it was probably close to noon. Somehow I'd managed to spend my entire morning hanging out with the baby, but it was time well spent in my opinion. Nothing was more important than spending time with your kid. For the moment, though, I headed to my study, a small room on the first floor that I'd reserved for my research. Sorry, I'm trying to clear this out, man. The desk inside was covered in handwritten reports and a few magic stones. I hadn't spent the last 6 months playing with my daughter and my sisters to the exclusion of anything else. I'd also been studying the prizes I brought back from the Begarid continent. It was these stones that had lent the Hydra its ability to shrug off my spells, forcing us into dangerous close-range combat. They absorbed any magic that came in contact with them. At a glance, they looked like ordinary light green scales. If not for their transparency, they wouldn't even have been identifiable as stones. I'd managed to learn a few basic facts about these from the library at the University of Magic. First of all, they were usually referred to as stones of absorption. Manatite hydras produced them naturally with their bodies. Since that species of monster had gone extinct thousands of years ago during the continental sundering, they were now incredibly rare and valuable. Many dragons produced magical stones or crystals inside their body. This was just one particularly unusual case in point. The stone in my staff, for example, had been retrieved from a draconic species of sea serpent. The effects of these stones varied widely, but many of them had direct magical applications of some sort. Jesus. Some could increase your magical capacity or reduce the amount of mana it took to cast spells. Others made your spells twice as powerful without increasing their mana cost. It wasn't that surprising that there was one capable of absorbing magic entirely. The tricky part was figuring out how exactly these stones were doing that. When you just left them sitting on a desk like this, the stones of absorption didn't actively suck the mana out of everything around them. Clearly, something had to happen first before, after a bit of experimentation, I soon realized that the stones had a front and a back. It was very hard to tell one side from the other, but they definitely existed. When I placed my hand on the back of the stone and fed it some mana, the front side would begin absorbing magic while emitting a high-pitched whine. In other words, these things didn't work automatically. You had to turn them on and off yourself. It was a little bit like the suction pads on the tentacles of an octopus. It seemed like the Hydra we fought had been activating its magic-absorbing armor as it saw the spells fly, rendering my attacks useless at the last second. I had a hard time imagining many people could react as quickly, but wild animals can often have much better dynamic vision and reflexes than any human being. Experimenting further, I also realized that the stone didn't exactly absorb magic in the way I'd been expecting. When I held it in my right hand and cast a spell at it with the other, the spell would disappear, but I didn't regain the mana I had spent. In fact, I was pretty sure it was costing me some mana, the same amount I'd used to cast the original spell. I'm going to take off my headphones real quick. Ugh. I would take more focused experiments to be sure what this meant, but I did have a working hypothesis. Basically, I suspected that the stone was converting the mana I fed it into waves that could instantly disintegrate anything else made of mana. The results were similar to the spell Disturb Magic, but I felt like these stones were even more thorough at obliterating the spells they interacted with. There were still many things this theory alone couldn't explain, of course. For example, figurines I'd created with magic were completely unaffected by the stones, even at point-blank range. Earthen figurines were immune to the waves. but the projectile from my stone cannon wasn't. I had no idea why that would be the case. Maybe the mana in the figurines had stabilized over time, making them immune to disruption? Anyway. There wasn't much point going down these rabbit holes, though. I didn't even have a good grasp of what mana really was. Rather than groping around for a comprehensive explanation, I wanted to focus on how I could use these things. And how I could counteract them in the future. With that thought in mind, I carried out another experiment. I had the feeling that I could use these stones to destroy some things disturbed magic couldn't. Magic circles, for example. Cliff had helped me out with this experiment. As I'd hoped, I managed to destroy both a barrier spell and the magic circle he'd used to cast it. The design on his original scroll was unaffected, but as long as the spell was in active use, the stones of absorption could erase the circle itself. That's pretty dope. However, they weren't able to affect a magic circle on the inside of a magical implement. Maybe it was because the circle was carved into the implement itself rather than drawn on its surface. That would make sense. Thinking back on our battle with the Hydra, I realized that it never deactivated the magic circle in its lair despite thrashing around all over the place. In any case, the most important takeaway was that these scales couldn't destroy everything of a magical nature. That said, they were probably more than effective enough to deal with most threats I might encounter. With one of these in my back pocket, I could break myself out the next time I blundered into a trap and landed on the inside of a barrier spell. Ideally, I would avoid blundering into traps in the first place, but it never hurt to have an insurance policy. At the moment, I was thinking about incorporating one of the stones into my prosthetic hand somewhere, maybe in the palm. It might be tricky to use that hand for both activating the stone and casting magic, but hopefully I'd get the hang of it with some practice. Hello, dear brother. You have a guest. I'd been tinkering around in my study for some time when Aisha popped her head in to announce that we had visitors. Her face was calm and composed. She'd snapped into professional maid mode. Who is it? Prince Zanoba. He is waiting for you in the living room. Wonder if he needs something. Not that I'd mind if he just came over on a whim, of course. Maybe he just wanted some company. Got it. Thanks, Aisha. I pushed myself up off the seat casually. Zanoba had been making progress on his own research into the automaton recently. My Zenith prosthesis had been a product of these efforts, and as it turned out, the automaton's legs and feet worked similarly to the hands and arms. I'd helped make the prototype this time. Zanoba drew up the plans. I created the model section by section with my magic, and Cliff inscribed it with the necessary magic circles. It was a slow, delicate process. We'd spent nearly a month making a single leg. Someday we'd hopefully be selling them alongside our artificial hands, but we were a long way away from mass-producing these things. Anyway, now that we'd gotten a good grasp of the limbs, Zanoba was finally starting to investigate the automaton's body. This involved locating fine seams between its sections and then carefully cutting them apart to study the innards. Right at the center of its chest, he'd found a magic stone. It was a pretty red crystalline thing of unusual size. After studying it, however, he realized that it wasn't actually just a single stone. It was a combination of numerous small ones, each covered in tiny magic circles. This was clearly the automaton's core. If we managed to decipher all the patterns etched onto it, we would theoretically be capable of making the same thing ourselves. And then, once we took our research to even higher heights, the Robo-Maid dream would finally become a reality. Unfortunately, Zanoba was struggling in the face of this new challenge. The circles on the core were unbelievably strange and complex. What's more, the patterns were full of snatches of ancient writing, notes, warnings, passages from obscure books, and preliminary scratched-out designs. Basically, it was clear that the creator of the automaton had still been perfecting the design for the core even as they built it. It seems that the masterpiece we'd found was in fact a failure or prototype. There was no telling what its creator had actually been going for. Making sense of all this was going to be much harder than any challenge we'd faced so far, but Zanoba was undaunted. He seemed, if anything, even more determined than before to carry out his life's mission. For whatever it was worth, he had my moral support. "Hey, Zanoba, sorry to keep you waiting." When I walked into the living room, Zanoba jumped up from the sofa where he'd been sipping his tea a moment earlier. "Ah, Master Rudius, my apologies for intruding on you like this." Julie and Ginger, who were standing in the corner of the room, followed his example and lowered their heads silently. "So, what can I do for you today?" "I was simply in the neighborhood, so I thought I'd drop by and say hello." "Huh, so it really was just a social call." "Got it. Well, make yourself at home." This was unusual behavior for Zanoba, but I wasn't going to turn him away or anything. As I settled down onto a chair, Julie trotted over by my side. "Look, Grandmaster Rudius, I finished another one." She held out a figurine for my examination. It was her latest attempt at a Richard figurine that I had her reproducing as an assignment. "Nice work," I said, studying it from multiple angles. "You're improving quickly. Keep churning them out for me, all right?" "Okay," Julie said with a cheerful bow. While I was off journeying across the Begarit continent, Julie had finished her original Richard figurine. I'd been genuinely surprised by how good it looked. It was clear she'd used my own version as a model, but in all honesty, hers was just better. For one thing, the stance was perfect. Even a total amateur was going to realize they were looking at a total badass. When I showed it to Norn, she couldn't help murmuring, "I want one," under her breath, so I gave the original to her as a present. She had it on a shelf in her dorm at the moment. Recognizing Julie's success for what it was, I tasked her with producing as many copies of the figurine as she could. It still took her quite a while to make a single one, but that wasn't really a big deal. The job was a good way to work on stretching her mana capacity, and hopefully we'd have a nice pile of them ready to go by the time we were ready to sell Norn's book. Yesterday, I saw... I don't know who's saying this. Okay. Yesterday, I saw Miss Norn at school. Oh, yeah? You bumped into each other? She say anything? She thanked me, so I thanked her, too. Aw, that's nice. Good for you, Julie. I reached out and patted Julie on the head affectionately. She stiffened up a little at my touch, but didn't flinch away. As it happened, Norn had recently finished her book about Richard. Even after she started learning the sword from me, she kept up with her writing. The book was short, and the prose was a bit clumsy and awkward. It only covered one part of Richard's life, too, the story of those cursed spears, beginning with Richard's loyal service to his lord and ending with his revenge. But despite all its flaws, she'd managed to capture Richard's personality perfectly. His pride, his grief, his boldness came across with startling clarity. With a bit of careful editing, I was confident we could sell it as a children's book. In order to test that theory, I read the draft to Julie, who absolutely loved it. She made me read it 3 times in a row and probably would have kept going if Ginger hadn't intervened. From the sound of things, nobody had ever read Julie stories like that when she was little. Perhaps it was a cultural thing. The dwarves apparently had traditional fairy tales of some kind, but maybe they didn't write books for children. Or maybe her parents were just too busy to spend time entertaining her. Not that it really mattered either way. Anyway, since Julie had enjoyed the book so much, I'd been planning to introduce her to Norn one of these days, but it seemed they'd beat me to the punch. Norn had probably been a little embarrassed to learn she had a fan already. It was nice to hear they'd gotten off on the right foot, though. Recognizing each other's talents is a good first step toward building a good working relationship. All of this meant we were making excellent progress on the preparations for our superb PR campaign. I was keeping up with my research and training myself, too. Overall, I felt good about how I was using my time. If I pushed myself to take on anything more than I was already handling, I'd probably be overloading myself. Maybe it would have been optimal to focus on a single specific area in which to specialize, but my feeling was that I'd never be the best at anything I tried. That was true in my first try at life, and it was probably true in this one too. There's always going to be someone better than you out there. Maybe I was the best mage at the university right now, but the world was full of unbelievably powerful people. There's such a thing as genuine talent. The kind of talent you can't compete with no matter how hard you try. I didn't feel any need to push myself to be the very best at any one thing, though. My goal was to be flexible enough to compete on multiple fronts. If I couldn't beat someone in a one-on-one fight, I'd just find a way to slip around them. It sounded good in theory, but of course, sometimes you might find yourself staring down a manatite hydra. I wanted to become powerful enough to defend my family, if nothing else. Fighting wasn't really my specialty, but I'd have to find ways to get stronger. Oh, right. You want to take a look at Lucy, Zanoba? Oh, you're willing to show me your daughter? Are you sure? I mean, yeah, is there some reason why I wouldn't? I suppose not. However, I believe there are certain countries where it's traditional to wait until a child turns 5 before letting anyone outside the family see them. Really? Huh. I'd rather show her off to everyone I can, personally. In any case, there was no reason to think too hard about all this right now. I just had to keep moving slowly, steadily forward. I was keeping up with my daily training and magic exercises, chipping away at my research projects and making lots of interesting friends. Compared to my last try at life, I'd been putting in a lot more effort and getting a lot more out of every day. It was fair to say I was doing a good job so far, by my standards at least. In other words, there was no need to rush things. If I pushed myself too hard, I'd eventually break down physically or mentally. My haste might make me careless, too. I didn't want to blunder into another disaster like I had with that Hydra. So for now, I was going to keep moving at my own pace, one step at a time. Where did I drop? Okay. I wanted to make my efforts at self-improvement a part of my daily routine. Hopefully that effort would pay off the next time I found myself facing a real challenge. What was the next step I should take at this point, though? I replaced my hand with a prosthetic, my research was coming along nicely, my relationships with my wives were excellent, my sisters and daughter were doing well, and our family had a solid financial safety net. Maybe it was about time I had Roxy teach me some king-tier water magic. Legends of the University, number 5. The boss has a soft spot for little kids. All right, there is chapter 5. I didn't know we were on the final page, but yeah, there it is. Chapter 6 is A Water King is Born. So we needed one more jumping jack, which means I have 30 jumping jacks and 20 of everything else. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. And while we're at that, oh, you don't like it? You don't like the bread? Okay. I need you to move. So, okay. Okay. 30. What? Oh, 40 jumping jacks? Oh, okay. Oh, whoa. I almost did 11. All right, so got the jumping jacks done. But it's 20 of everything else, right? Say, you drop down on me, and you and I are gonna have problems, buddy. Problems. Stay. You don't like it? No. Okay. And now it's just 20 push-ups, buddy. And that's 20 push-ups, buddy. Yeah. That's 20 push-ups. Alrighty. Go ahead. All right. 2 hours and 3 chapters. Well, around 2 hours. Hey, that seems to have helped with my sinuses a bit. All right, guys. I will be jumping back into this. So, we're going to have a breathy reading of the first part. Sorry. All right, here we go. Chapter 6. A Water King is born. In a normally quiet corner of the University of Magic, a suggestive conversation was taking place. No, I said no. The place, a small building known to a certain students as the PE storage shed. In front of its door, a young man had seized a blue-haired girl by the arm. Come on, what's the big deal? I'm begging you here, teach. No means no. The girl's attitude was one of curt rejection. Her face was turned to one side, and she was pouting in displeasure, but the young man wasn't backing down. Just this one time, please? I've already given you my answer. Please let go. I've already given you my answer. Let go of me, please. Lunch is ending soon. Hey, don't be like that. It was clear he had no intention of releasing her. The girl looked around the area, her expression troubled. This was a quiet corner of the campus, but that didn't mean it was deserted. There were several people in the area. But when the girl shot them pleading glances, everyone simply looked away. There was a simple reason for this. They were afraid of the young man harassing her. He was the most infamous delinquent in this entire city. Okay, I gotta step away. I gotta use the restroom. Oh boy. Hey, Toby. Ready? Apologies, guys. I didn't realize I had to use the restroom. Alrighty. It wasn't that they didn't want to help the girl, but they all knew that any attempted intervention would likely be pointless and might well cost them dearly. None of them were brave enough to risk it. Think over it for a minute, okay? This is a win-win argument we're talking about. You might not like the idea right now, but in the long run, we're both going to benefit. Well, I suppose, yes. Hey, how about this? If you do this for me, I'll do anything you want in return. Look, I just... As the girl's resolve faltered, the man pressed his advantage ruthlessly. He moved in closer, nearly pressing his mouth to her ear as he whispered honeyed words. The girl's face was growing redder by the moment, fiddling with her long braided hair as she looked down at the ground in embarrassment. Hey, it's the student council! But at that very moment, the most handsome man in the university arrived on the scene. A conspicuous white-haired girl in sunglasses followed close behind him. Oh, it's Sir Luke! Silent Fitz is here, too! The relieved onlookers recognized these new arrivals immediately. They were Luke and Fitz of the student council. Sir Luke is so dashing! What perfect timing! Take me now, Luke! Is it just me, or has Fitz gotten a lot cuter lately? Man, I never would have guessed she was a girl. Ignoring the shrill cries of their audience, the two of them strode up to the young man and the girl. Well, Rudius, we're here because someone reported you were assaulting a female student, but... Luke trailed off mid-sentence to heave a heavy sigh. He knew both of the participants in this little farce, Rudius Greyrat and his wife, Roxy. The girl wasn't a student, in other words, and Rudius hadn't been assaulting her. Having confirmed these facts, Luke turned and started walking back to the way he'd come. Fitz, you deal with this, please. Scratching at her ears awkwardly, Fitz nodded. Right. As the young knight left the scene, Roxy let out a long sigh of her own. A female student? Really? You can't blame them, teacher, said Rudius, nodding indulgently. Most of the students aren't aware that you're a professor yet. At this point, he looked over at Silent Fitz for support and found her looking displeased, puffing her cheeks out slightly. What's the matter, Sylphie? Look, Rudy, I know Roxy is your wife, but that doesn't mean you can force her to do something she doesn't want to. Sometimes a girl just isn't in the mood, you know? Huh? Right, absolutely, said Rudius, looking a bit nonplussed. Honestly, maybe she's better at this stuff, but you could try asking me instead. Wait, hold on. Could this be... Suddenly, Rudius's eyes lit up. Stepping quickly over to Fitz, he poked her cheek with his finger. She responded by turning her head the other way and puffing out her cheeks even further. It is! It is! You're jealous, Sylphie! With his exclamation, he threw his arms around Fitz and squeezed her tightly. Fitz didn't seem entirely displeased, but she didn't stop scowling either. I wouldn't say I'm jealous, really. More like disappointed. Don't worry, honey. I won't leave you out. We'll do this together. What? Are you serious? You mean all three of us? Rudy brought his mouth to Fitz's ear and murmured his reply. Yeah, that's right. We can have Roxy teach both of us at once. Roxy's gonna teach us? Well, of course, she's the expert after all. Fitz glanced over at Roxy, who turned her face to the side sulkingly. I still didn't say I'm willing yet, you know. Come on, don't say that. Sylphie wants to learn too. Isn't that right, Sylphie? I don't know. It sounds kind of embarrassing. Still wrapped up in Rudius's arms, Fitz squirmed around uncertainly. The sunglasses she'd once worn as a disguise hid her eyes from view, but it was obvious they were shining with emotion. But I guess I'll do it for you, Rudy. Oh, Sylphie! I love the misunderstanding that she thinks it's about sex. It's not. Roxy looked on with envy in her eyes. That was exactly what Rudius needed. It was time to press the attack once more. Why don't you want to teach me, Roxy? Don't you like me anymore? This time, he took a deeply wounded tone. It was enough to make Roxy flinch. Of course I still like you, Rudy. I love you very much. Then why are you being like this? Well, if I teach you this, I won't have anything left that I'm better at than you. What? Don't be ridiculous, Roxy. You're on a higher plane of existence than me. Roxy sighed at this. Okay, look, I've been meaning to say this for a while, but I think your opinion of me is a little overblown. I'm a petty person, really. The sort of woman who gets upset about her students surpassing her. It's not a problem, I assure you. You're perfect just the way you are. Pettiness and all. Anyway, I spent months of my life learning this, you know? You and Sylphie are more talented than I ever was, so you'll probably master it much more quickly. At this point, Fitz finally realized that she'd misunderstood the situation, and her dreamy smile gave way to a confused expression. Sorry, Rudy, what exactly are we talking about here? Oh, right, I was asking Roxy to teach me King Tier water spell. Are you familiar with the concept of a romantic bike ride? Allow me to elaborate. I'm referring specifically to a youthful couple sharing a single bicycle. Most typically, a boy will be pedaling up in front with the girl seated behind him. She sits sideways on the luggage rack, perhaps with her arms wrapped tightly around his waist. Wrapped tightly around his waist. The best isn't in the English light novel, but it's just the best. Oh, okay. The boy might be doing the steering and pedaling, but in many cases the bike itself belongs to the girl. The natural habitat for an event of this kind is a riverbank in the early evening. The warm red glow of the setting sun conveniently disguises any mild blushing that might be going on. At the moment, I found myself in a very comparable situation. The sun was still high in the sky, but the nape of Sylphie's neck was sitting right in front of me. By moving my nose forward, I could easily fill my nostrils with the sweet scent of her skin. I also had my arms around her waist, with my hands crossed right around her navel. My upper body was pressed closely against hers. I could feel the beating of her heart through my chest. It was truly splendid. Just as a side note, I should mention that I was keeping my lower body a bit separated from hers for reasons that don't need to be stated. She was my wife and all, but I still needed to treat her with respect. Also, I'd seen several news stories about car crashes caused by a passenger groping their driver. We were on a horse at the moment, which wasn't quite the same thing, but it still wasn't a good idea to distract the person holding the reins. Matsukaze really is a good horse, said a voice from just beyond Sylphie. He's calm and does what he's told, but he's also very strong. I leaned to look over Sylphie's shoulder at the back of the blue-haired girl, and the back of the blue-haired girl came into view. It was Roxy. She was sitting just in front of Sylphie. Yep, you don't see a horse like this every day, that's for sure. The three of us had squeezed onto the back of a single horse. Matsukaze was the most neglected of the household pets. Didn't seem to mind this excessive burden one bit. He was trotting along as if we weren't even there. Didn't Ginger pick her out for you, Rudy? Asked Sylphie. She's got a good eye for horses. You know a lot about horses yourself, Sylphie? Asked Roxy. I wouldn't go that far, but I did get to see some of the best horses in the Kingdom of Asura a couple times, like the one the captain of the Royal Knights rides. I see. I'm sure that must be a splendid animal. At this, Matsukaze whinnied as if to object. Oh, I'm sorry, Matsukaze, said Roxy hurriedly. You're quite splendid, too. After all, you're the one and only steed of the Grey Rat family. Did certain animals understand human languages in this world, or maybe Roxy was just a horse whisperer? Probably not. Pets start responding to your voice when you talk to them enough, that's all. Aisha was always chattering at Bite and Dillo, too. In any case, I have to admit, it's a bit embarrassing riding in front at my age. Every time we met someone coming the opposite direction, Roxy would blush and pull her hat down over her face. I suppose sitting in front of the person holding the reins was comparable to riding in the baby seat in a car. I wouldn't have minded following you two on Dillo or something, you know. Nice try, Roxy, Sylphie said with a smile. I bet you were planning to run off the instant we took our eyes off you. I'm not a child. I wasn't going to run away. Enjoying the sound of my wives chattering, I took some time to gaze at the scenery around us. At the moment, we were on the outskirts of the city. There was a small, beautiful stream running to our right. On our left, there was a large plain with a forest in the distance. The northern territories weren't the most fertile part of the world, but at this time of year, there was lots of green. Up until a few minutes ago, we'd been passing fields of wheat and potatoes, but now we were surrounded by empty, undeveloped country. I wasn't entirely sure how many hours we'd been riding now, but we'd clearly come far enough to get some privacy. Watching the water on our right, I caught glimpses of fish as the sunlight reflected off their scales. This was one of several smaller streams that fed into the river which ran past the city of Sharia. It might be nice to come out of the city to fish on a sunny day, even if I didn't travel this far. Not that I'd ever fished before. I told you two I was going to teach you, and I intend to do a proper job of it. The reason we'd come all the way out here was simple enough. Roxy had folded. My repeated pleas and badgering had finally worn her down. I'll teach you the only king tier water spell I've mastered, Lightning Storm. Roxy still sounded disappointed about this turn of events, so I reached past Sylphie's side and stroked her shoulders affectionately. In any case, Lightning Storm, huh? Just based on the name, it sounded like a standard electricity-based spell. Now that I thought about it, though, lightning wasn't one of the standard magical disciplines in this world. I'd never even seen anyone use an electric-type spell before. And on top of that, this wasn't a king-tier spell. I had to assume it was going to... Oh, this was a king-tier spell. I had to assume it was going to be dramatic. Alright, I think we've come far enough. After a bit more time on the road, Roxy called us to a halt and hopped down off Matsukaze. She proceeded to tie him to a small tree about as thick as her leg. Hey, teacher, do you remember Caravaggio? Oh, yes, that was the name of Paul's horse, wasn't it? That really brings me back. Roxy smiled, looking a bit nostalgic. It had been 12 years since she helped me become a water saint. I'd picked up a bunch of other skills in the meantime, but only now was I finally moving up to king tier. It felt like I'd taken a lot of detours on the road at the moment. But on the topic of the horse, poor Caravaggio had very nearly died back then. Roxy had just managed to save his life, but he could have been killed instantly. It was possible she'd forgotten about that after all this time, so I felt the need to bring it up. Is there any risk of another accident like the one we had back then? I don't think so, no, but we wouldn't want Matsukaze catching cold in the rain, so you should make an earth fortress to shelter him. Got it. I promptly turned and enclosed our horse in an earthen igloo of sorts. He accepted this with admirable aplomb. Should I be waiting at a distance or anything? Said Sylphie, pulling on her rain jacket. No, that won't be necessary, replied Roxy, doing the same. Even a saint tier spell was enough to leave you drenched, so I proposed that we bring these along as a precautionary measure. I pulled mine on as well. Is everyone ready? Yep, whenever you are. Ready. Roxy nodded and pointed at a tree far off in the distance. It was an enormous thing, even from far away. I could tell that its trunk was incredibly thick. I'll be using that tree as my target. I can only use this once today, so watch very carefully. Got it! With another small nod at my reply, Roxy closed her eyes and began breathing deeply. Her hands clutched her staff tightly as she focused intently on the task at hand. This went on for longer than I'd expected. She could fire off a saint tier spell quickly, but apparently this wasn't so easy for her. Although I didn't have any eye of magical power or anything, I felt pretty confident that she was using this time to gather up a huge amount of mana for the spell. After a few long minutes, Roxy's eyes snapped open and she murmured, "All right then, let's begin." With those words, she stabbed her staff down into the ground. With her left hand, she held it steady. With her right, she clutched the magic stone on top of it. And finally, she began to chant, slowly and carefully, as if reviewing every word before she spoke it. "Oh, spirits of the magnificent waters, I beseech the Prince of Thunder, grant me my wish. Bless me with thy savagery, and reveal to this insignificant servant a glimpse of thy power. Let fear strike the heart of man, as thy divine hammer strikes its anvil, and cover the land with water." A few sentences in, I recognized the words and blinked in confusion. Come, O rain, and wash everything away in thy flood of destruction." Black clouds rapidly filled the sky above us. Simultaneously, a harsh and pelting rain began to fall. Wind whipped across the plain, driving the water up and under my coat. My robe was soaked instantly. Lightning flickered up above us, threatening to strike the ground at any moment. It was all very impressive, but I'd seen it before. This was the Saint tier spell Cumulonimbus. "I call upon you, mighty spirit of light, shining lord of the heavens." But when I expected the chant to end, Roxy kept right on going. "Do you see the impudent foe towering before us? Do you see your sworn enemy and all his arrogance? I would be the holy blade that strikes him down. Let your radiant power teach him that the Emperor yet reigns supreme. With every word that left her mouth, the sky above us was compressed. The black clouds that had stretched across the horizon collapsed in on themselves, forming a circle that drew smaller and denser by the second. Crackling electricity arced all around the dark mass, and finally, when the ring of cloud had shrunk to a mere dot in the sky, lightning! A pillar of pure light fell to the earth. It was a bolt of lightning, yes, but it was nothing like any I had seen before. The sound wave reached us a split second later. The roar was deafening, even at this range. Sylphie clapped her hands over her ears and grimaced. I, on the other hand, was too busy staring slack-jawed out into the distance. I couldn't find anything to say. Not a single word. After a few moments, I managed to swallow. At some point, I'd clutched my hands into fists. They were trembling. Once the roar had swept past us, nothing remained. The massive jet-black clouds were gone. The sheets of torrential rain were gone. The blinding pillar of light was gone. And that massive tree was gone, too. There was simply nothing left. The sky above us was clear and blue. The earth around us was wet. But that was the only hint remaining of what had just transpired. When I strained my eyes, I could just barely make out a black clump of carbonized wood where the tree had once stood. Releasing her grip on the staff, Roxy staggered to one side. I hurried to catch her before she could fall. Are you all right? I'm glad I pulled that off. With my mana capacity, I can only use it once, even with my staff. Did you get a good look at the spell, Rudy? Absolutely, teacher. I hadn't been able to tear my eyes away from that for a single second. I remembered every word of the incantation, too. Do you think you're ready to try it? I'll give it a shot. After handing Roxy off to Sylphie, I turned away, held out my own staff, and tightened my grip on its shaft. Aquahartia had been with me since the day I turned 10, supporting me through all the turbulence in my life. I felt confident I could cast this spell without its help, but I wanted to use it anyway. Trying to remember what I'd just seen as precisely as possible, I looked up at the sky and began to chant. I'm going to skip all the stuff. A huge amount of mana poured from my hands into the staff, then shot up into the heavens. So yeah, he just recited the same thing I just read, basically. As the storm clouds gathered, I felt magic raging all around me, ready to be harnessed and unleashed. If I had chanted the word cumulonimbus next, the spell would have completed itself. I wasn't going to do that, though, and I thought I understood why. If I gave the spell a coherent form, it would probably be impossible to achieve that compression of the clouds. I needed to move on to the next stage without stabilizing the spell. And then he reads the next set. With every phrase I spoke, the magic in the air raged more and more intensely. I had no choice but to pour more mana into the spell to keep it from spinning out of control entirely. I was forcing the clouds to compress, squeezing them together with all my might. This spell demanded power, raw, brute power. That was the only thing that made it possible. I'd never cast anything that demanding such ferocious force before. Oh, that demanded such ferocious force before. No, that wasn't entirely true. Something about this was familiar to me. It wasn't so different from what I'd felt when I was pushing my stone cannon to the very limit of its potential. The moment I realized that, the spell suddenly felt much easier to control. Lightning! When I spoke the final word, I could sense something like an empty hole open up underneath my compressed ball of mana. I pushed everything down through it, all at once. Once again, a great pillar of lightning hit the earth, and its roar swept past us. I hadn't used any particular target, but the spell had struck the ground exactly where I wanted it to. Unlimited power! Once again, there was nothing left in its wake. There were no black clouds above us, only clear blue sky. But the ground was a bit more sodden than before, and our coats were dripping with water. The afterimage of the lightning was still flashing before my eyes. My ears were still ringing from its roar. I pulled it off. Sylphie was the first to speak. All she managed, though, was a startled, "Oh, wow." Just like that, I was a king-tier water mage. That was a little frustrating. On our way back home, Sylphie's expression was slightly downcast. After my successful attempt, she'd given the spell a shot as well. Roxy started her off with cumulonimbus. She failed the first time, but pulled it off on her second try. Unfortunately, she hadn't managed to cast lightning. Her first attempt had failed, and it had also drained her dry. Compressing the mana was the hardest part of the spell by far. I'd probably only succeeded because I had experience doing something similar. Still, Sylphie was a quick learner. I had a feeling she'd figure it out if she gave it a couple more tries. "Don't feel bad, Sylphie," said Roxy with a smile. "I still mess it up once every 5 times or so." In a way, I was a little glad Sylphie had failed this time. If both of us had pulled it off on our first try, Roxy might have taken a hit to her pride. This was interesting, though. Based on what I saw today, Sylphie seemed to have a larger mana capacity than Roxy did, and Roxy's wasn't small at all from what I understood. Well, somebody succeeded on their very first try. You're incredible, Rudy. Yes, that was certainly impressive. I have to admit, I was expecting it to happen, but it was a bit depressing that you pulled it off that easily. I couldn't find anything to say to the two of them. Sure, I'd started using magic around the age of 2, and I put some effort into expanding the mana capacity. But given how much I ended up with, I'd probably been born with an unnaturally large supply in the first place. I'd put in the effort, but I also gotten lucky. That made it tricky to say much of anything about my abilities as a mage. In any case, I needed to stay focused for now. We weren't home yet, and my wives were exhausted. Once we were safely back, I'd have to give them both shoulder massages. We'd be skipping the nocturnal activities tonight also. We were all worn out. "Oh, look, Rudy," called Sylphie. "Isn't that a pretty sunset?" I looked over to the west where the sun was starting to sink below the horizon. The sky all around it was a brilliant shade of crimson. Nature was just as beautiful here as it was back on my old world. That was one thing that hadn't changed. Yeah, it's gorgeous. I suppose I was supposed to tack on, but not as gorgeous as you there. Or sorry. Was I supposed to tack on but not as gorgeous as you there? With a small sigh, Sylphie leaned against me slightly. She looked just about ready to doze off on the spot. Oh, dear God. I looked over at chat. I shouldn't have. You two idiots. We would probably be making it home before it got dark out, but I'd have to stay alert until we reached the city limits. These two couldn't use magic right now, so if any monsters popped out, I needed to deal with them. You know, sometimes I find myself wondering if this is all a dream, murmured Roxy as she gazed at the sunset. Sylphie tilted her head quizzically. A dream? That's right. Maybe I'm still trapped in the labyrinth and this is a happy little delusion I'm seeing right before I die. I kept my eyes scanning the area around us for threats, half listening to the conversation. Sylphie and Roxy were speaking slowly, fatigue evident in their voices. I'm a lot happier right now than I was 6 months ago. I got married for one thing, and I was hired as a professor at the university. I suppose I seem like something of an interloper to you, Sylphie, but I'm happy I'm here, riding this horse with both of you. I'd felt Sylphie flinch a little when Roxy spoke the word interloper, but she shook her head in denial. You're not an interloper, Roxy, and I'm glad you've been so kind and considerate about all this. I don't think I'd win if you turned it into some sort of competition. Or I don't think I'd win, sorry. Anyway. Sylphie's voice was so uncertain that I felt the need to interrupt with a hug at this point. She took one hand off the reins to pat my arm. It was her way of saying, I know. I mean, I just got lucky, really, she continued after a moment. I got to know Rudy when we were little, and then I ran into him again when he was really desperate for help. I never would have caught his attention otherwise. I think you're being a bit too modest, said Roxy, her voice slightly troubled. Well, I probably wouldn't even be here today if I hadn't met Rudy as a kid. What do you mean? He taught me magic when I was young, you know? It's the only thing that kept me alive. Sylphie began to recount her story of her life after the displacement incident. She'd been unlucky enough to emerge high in the sky above the royal palace of Asura. By quickly casting a spell, she just barely managed to land safely, but at that moment, her hair lost its original color, possibly a side effect of spending too much mana in her terror. Princess Ariel had taken a personal liking to her, but it was her rare ability to cast spells silently that had earned her a place in the royal court. And when Ariel was outmaneuvered by her political rivals, that same ability had allowed Sylphie to fight off dozens of assassins as they fled. In the picture she painted, my magic was the only thing that kept her alive through all of this. Back when I was working as Princess Ariel's guardian mage, this one thought kept popping into my head. If I didn't know how to use magic, I'd probably be a slave right now. As she spoke, I found myself wondering how different my own life would have been if I hadn't met Roxy or Sylphie when I was young. If not for Roxy, I wouldn't have found the courage to leave that house for years. I was confident of that much. If I'd never taken a step outside, never met Sylphie, could I have survived the displacement incident? Could I have survived the displacement incident? Could I have made my way across the demon continent? Well, if I'd never met Sylphie, I wouldn't have ended up getting sent to the city of Roa, which meant I wouldn't have met Eris or Ghislaine. Maybe my parents would have shipped me off to school eventually. I would have hit a wall with my magic at some point, so I might have ended up asking them to send me to the Ranoa University of Magic anyway. Under different circumstances, Paul might have approved instead of telling me to wait until I was 12. But of course, I wouldn't have found Sylphie waiting for me in Ranoa. She wouldn't have followed me up here, either. Maybe I would have ended up in the same class as Linny and Persinna and fallen in love with one of them. When we graduated, I'd head back to the Great Forest and live among the beast folk. Well, no, the displacement incident would have taken place eventually, so I probably would have rushed back home to Asura. In any case, my life would have looked completely different. Still, I couldn't help feeling like I would have run into Sylphie somewhere and fallen in love with her, of course. Yes, surely that was predestined by the laws of causality, or just fate, if you prefer. Whatever. My life changed completely the day I met Rudy, Sylphie concluded, with her story at an end. I mean, I did put in a lot of effort, too, but I think I was lucky more than anything else. So when I see someone like you, who changed Rudy's life for the better, I know you both love each other. Well, I don't really want him to lose that just because I'm around, I guess. I probably don't have this right to object when I just got here first. Sorry, I don't know how to put this. That's all right, said Roxy quietly. I understand what you're trying to say, and I'm very happy you have such a high opinion of me. I couldn't see Roxy's face since she was sitting up front, but I could see that her shoulders were trembling slightly. I stretched my arms out and pulled both her and Sylphie into a hug. Rudy. Back in my old world, choosing Roxy would have meant losing Sylphie, and it could have worked out that way here if not for Sylphie's decision to forgive me. The only lucky person here was me. Given my less than ideal track record as a husband, promising that I'd cherish them forever would probably ring hollow. I just have to speak with my actions instead. Once we made it home that evening, I took some time to go over what I'd learned from the day's lesson on King Tier magic. Lightning was a tricky spell, but the basic concept was simple. You spread a huge amount of mana all across the sky, then concentrated it in one location and dropped it down on your target. Physically speaking, you created the storm clouds, then fired off a bolt of lightning. Simple as that. In retrospect, cumulonimbus and lightning were essentially two parts of a single spell. The destructive power was the greatest of any spell I'd seen so far. That was only natural, though. I didn't know of any magic that demanded more raw mana than cumulonimbus and lightning concentrated all that energy into a single spot. Up until now, my fully charged stone cannon had been the most lethal spell in my arsenal, but this one might have surpassed it. With this many gigawatts at my fingertips, I could launch myself into the future if I wanted to. God fucking damn it, I knew it. The hell is a gigawatt? Bum 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 ba-da-dum bum 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 ba-da-dum bum 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 ba-da-dum. All right, anyway. But seriously though, although the name of this spell was lightning, the real secret behind its power lay in the mana compression step. I was curious if any king tier spells in other disciplines might be applications of the same basic technique. In any case, now that I'd gotten through casting the spell once, I'd be able to use it silently in the future. The next time I used it, I was fairly sure I could speed up both the cloud formation and the compression phases and drop the bolt of lightning much more quickly than before. But although I was planning to practice with it, I wasn't sure I'd get many chances to put this spell to practical use. After all, if I was up against a single target, my stone cannon was usually more than enough. Lightning was kind of an overkill spell on the whole. It would be more useful if I could find a way to reduce its power. With this thought in mind, I started playing around a little on a much smaller scale, and after several failed experiments, I stumbled across a way to generate a strong electric current. The method involved silently casting a tiny cumulonimbus spell, compressing it, and firing off a lightning spell in the direction of my target. This resulted in a small, crackling bolt of electricity that could be directed with considerable accuracy. Its voltage seemed to be fairly low, too, so the damage it did wasn't too excessive. I wasn't sure exactly how this worked, but it seemed like it might come in handy. It probably wasn't suitable for extremely close-range combat. You'd end up shocking yourself along with your target. On the bright side, it wasn't going to do any lasting damage. At worst, you'd be incapacitated for a time. But there were lots of other magic attack spells that didn't run the risk of hurting their own caster. Still, it felt worth trying to refine this. I could use a spell designed to stun someone instead of kill them. Lightning branches through the air to reach its target, so it would be impossible to avoid, and the shock might even be effective at disabling someone protected by battle aura. I didn't have anyone to test that on at the moment, but if Batty Gaddy came back, I could ask him to be my guinea pig. If nothing else, it might be a nice surprise to pull out of my sleeve against a more powerful opponent. Incidentally, although this spell was just a tiny form of lightning, I decided to call it electric so I could distinguish between the two. What a productive day this had been. Legends of the University, number 6. The boss has an electric personality. Oh my god. Mana compression to selfie. Yeah, that's true. All right. So I got 40 squats and 30 of everything else. I'm here for it. I'm here for it. And hey, timer ran out. So any that are redeemed after this point, go to the next chapter. Hey, chapter 6 only took 30 minutes. There we go. It's BADI, by the way. Let me actually type it out so you guys know what it is. I think that's how. Yeah. So there you go. That's Batty Gaddy. All right. Man, I need to take a pill just to try and get my sinuses back on track. Dear God. This is the worst, man. I hate when this happens. All right, within the next hour, my sinuses should have gotten better. Hopefully by 6, I'll be okay. Time to do my exercises. So it's 30 of everything except squats. Gotcha. Alrighty, there's 30. And now on to squats. Oh, oh, that hurt. All right, heel touches. Oh. There's 30 of that. Crunches. All right. Crunches done. All right. Whew. All right, there's that. Push-ups. That's all that's left. All right, a third of the way there. That's 10 down. Twenty. Mm. $30. Cool. Ah. Okay. Volume 7 is 17 pages. And volume 8 is 18 pages. So not too bad. There's a picture in 17. Whew. So that'll take us to page 208, and we'll be 60% through by the time we get done. Okay. Next chapter is, yeah, that's what I meant. If I said something different, I meant chapter. Hang on a second, guys. I gotta, here's my nose hairs poking and bothering me. Oh. All right. Hour and 15 minutes to get through 2 chapters. Let's do this. Dude, even with a bathroom break, I got through that last chapter pretty quickly. It was nice. Chapter 7, The Wedding Ceremony. I'd been planning to sleep alone the night I became a Water King. This was mainly because Roxy and Sylphie were both tuckered out. So I didn't feel like the time for romance. It didn't feel like the time for romance. I was there. Is that even one of my hairs? That's way too long. It's got to be a Toby hair. I was pleasantly tired myself, but I knew I wouldn't be able to keep my hands to myself if I got into bed with either of them, so I decided we should all sleep in different rooms. Whew. Trying to get my mojo back. Well, my breath, honestly. When I mentioned this to Aisha, though, she insisted on sleeping with me herself. This sort of thing happened plenty of times before. I never actively invited her, but when she asked to sleep with me, I never turned her down. There was no real reason to refuse, so I gave her my permission. Of course, this was going to be strictly platonic kind of sleeping. As Aisha celebrated, though, I noticed that Norn was looking on with something that looked like envy in her eyes. Norn was already supposed to be staying over here tonight. Knowing her, though, there probably wasn't much point in suggesting that she join us. That was my assumption, at least, but when I threw the offer out there just to be polite, Norn actually took me up on it. I ended up sandwiched in between my sisters that night. Aisha was lying on my right, and Norn took my left. Before long, they were snoring away with their heads resting on my arms. Aisha was one thing, but I was a bit perplexed that Norn had gone along with this. Her peaceful little face wasn't giving me any clues either. Maybe it was her way of telling me that she'd accepted me as a kind of substitute father. I trust you enough to sleep cuddled up against you, or something like that, maybe. I was pinned in place with my arms outstretched, but I felt profoundly happy in that moment. It was almost as if I'd found a part of me that I'd been missing. Just as a bird needs 2 wings, perhaps a man needs 2 sisters on his arms. This thought gave rise to an idea that sent a jolt running down my spine. Man, I want to have a threesome with Sylphie and Roxy. It was the voice of the devil, no doubt, whispering these words into my ear. Some evil snake, its tongue flickering around suggestively, was trying to its best to lead me astray. I couldn't let myself continue thinking about this. In theory, it was something I'd been interested in for many years, but in practice, I had no idea how I'd even begin the conversation. They both loved me, but that didn't mean they'd be comfortable with a request like that. I could take no for an answer, of course, but what if even asking them destroyed our relationship? I didn't think that was likely, but I couldn't help worrying about it. It was like I was dissatisfied with our current arrangement. I was spending alternate nights with two very beautiful women, after all. What's more, I was in love with both of them. One had already given me a child. What did I have to complain about? Nothing, that's what. That said, I didn't want to try sleeping with both of them at once. Part of it was that they both approached it so differently. Sophie was a bit on the submissive side. As a general rule, she did anything I asked her to in bed. When I suggested we try something new, she'd often lower her eyes anxiously, but she never objected. That's not to say she was a dead fish, though. Once we actually got started, she always enjoyed herself. Within a couple of minutes, she'd be gasping for air and clinging to me desperately. It was obvious how much she wanted to please me, and it was adorable. Roxy, on the other hand, was something of a technician. She was constantly making use of the things she learned from Linelise, trying to increase her skills. When I asked her to try something, she'd give some thought to the best way to do it. When I offered to do something myself, she'd make all sorts of suggestions. Given the difference in our sizes, we had some physical challenges to overcome. But she was creative and hard-working enough to find ways around them, and that was just as adorable in its own way. Sophie was the indulgent type, and Roxy was an experimenter. They were both wonderful. I didn't prefer one over the other. It was possible I'd eventually start enjoying my time with one of them more, but even then, I wasn't planning to neglect the other. My intention was to treat them as equally as I possibly could. Right. I love both of them equally, so it really... Oh, I skipped a word. Okay, I was like... So, was it really that wrong to think about sleeping with both of them at once? Surely the answer was no. Any red-blooded man has some interest in such things. It's simply our nature. However, that didn't mean I was going to voice these thoughts. Sometimes it's wisest to keep your more extreme desires to yourself if you want to maintain healthy relationships. This was the very reason I'd never let myself bring this up before. As of this moment, at least, I was confident that wasn't going to change. The next morning, I headed over to Cliff's laboratory. Cliff's research was focused on the development of magical implements, specifically ones capable of counteracting curses. He'd insisted that I was welcome to drop in on him at any time, but whenever I dropped by, I made sure to listen carefully at the door. Depending on the noises I heard from inside, I sometimes had to turn around and leave. Today, there didn't seem to be anything problematic going on in there, so I knocked on the door. "Come in! The door's open!" called a voice from within. I stepped into the laboratory to find a little Elise sitting by the far window. She was resting her cheek on her hand and gazing out at the street, her long curly hair glimmering in the sun. The woman was picturesque when she wasn't talking, but I knew her too well to be impressed. She was probably thinking something unspeakably dirty thoughts. "Are you the only one home, little Elise?" "That's right." Cliff was very busy these days and hadn't been making much progress on his research. We'd been talking for months about finding the time to improve his existing prototypes using the stones of absorption, but it still hadn't happened yet. "Cliff's off working on the wedding preparations again." That right there was one of the major reasons. Cliff and Linelise were getting married soon. "I keep offering to help out," she continued, "but he's determined to do it all himself. Try not to hold it against him. Men can be prideful about these things, you know." Before we left for the Beggarid continent, Cliff had promised Linelise he'd marry her when we returned. When we made it back, though, he hadn't even begun to prepare yet. That wasn't his fault by any means. We told him we might be gone for 2 years, but we had ended up making it back in 6 months. It would have been odd to find him ready and waiting. However, Cliff was the kind of guy who took his promises seriously. With remarkable focus and stubbornness, he'd gotten everything arranged over the last few months. First and foremost, he'd found them a place to live, bought the furniture, and planned out everything they needed to move in. For the most part, he handled all of this on his own, although I helped out a bit with the real estate hunt. Unlike me, he wasn't interested in buying a house. He'd eventually settled on renting an apartment in the student district. If it ever got too cramped for them, he figured they could just move into a bigger place. I was a bit surprised by that attitude, considering Cliff was something of a show-off by nature, but on the other hand, he wasn't swimming in cash at the moment, so it was perfectly reasonable. He couldn't have purchased a pricey home, not without financial help from Lilius at least. I knew she was pretty well off. Oh, on that note, congratulations, Lilius. They were in the final stages now. The wedding was scheduled for next month. Something about Lilius wearing a pure white dress felt slightly out of character, but as long as the two of them were happy, that was all that really mattered. You mind if I wait around until Cliff comes back? Not at all. Lilius was keeping up her side of the conversation, but she hadn't even looked in my direction yet, and now, still gazing out the window, she let out a long, deep sigh. It was the kind of sigh that came with its own subtitles. I'm so very troubled. Won't anyone ask what's wrong? You having second thoughts about the marriage or anything? I ventured. Oh, of course not. Cliff's so sweet and devoted that I almost feel like I don't deserve him. I couldn't be happier that we're getting married. Fair enough. I was only a spectator here, but as far as I could tell, Cliff was nothing but loving and loyal to Lilius. That's not to say that he was a perfect person. He had plenty of flaws, but he was still a young man, not even 20 years old yet, in fact. When you took his potential for future growth into consideration, the guy was a real catch. So why do you keep sighing, then? Isn't it obvious? Ah, I see. That meant it was a sex thing, presumably. Cliff's been so busy that he only sleeps with me twice a week. Yeah, I figured as much. That's too bad, but what can you do? He's doing it all for you, Lilius. Yes, I understand all that, believe me. And once you finally move into your love nest, you probably won't emerge for a solid week, right? I was speaking from experience. The moment we got back from the Begarit continent, Lilius and Cliff had shut themselves up in here for days. It was enough to make you wonder if all they really cared about was the sex. Not that I had any right to say so, given my own healthy libido. I can't help being jealous of you, Rudius. Why? Sometimes I go without for a couple of days myself. Yes, but you get to fool around with Sylphie and Roxy at once, don't you? I'm satisfied with Cliff, of course, but I'm sure you three have a lot of fun together. Wait, what? No, we don't have threesomes or anything. What? Really? That's a pity. It's quite a good time, I assure you. Why don't you give it a shot? Oh no, the devil's tempting me again. Don't listen to her, Rudius. Begone, Mara. Amen. Scandalous. Disgraceful. I'm going to get you banned from the library, Lilius. I don't think Sylphie or Roxy would mind, you know. Easy for you to say, woman. What if I destroy my marriages? I suppose Roxy can be a bit uptight sometimes. She might not react too well if you drop the idea on her all of a sudden. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Sylphie tended to go along with anything I proposed. It was hard to know if she felt or how she felt about things, and sometimes I wondered if she was sacrificing her own desires to please me. But if I told her I wanted to try this, I was confident she'd agree. Things were different with Roxy, though. Despite her no-nonsense personality, she had a surprisingly innocent side to her. For all I knew, the moments I proposed a threesome, she'd start packing her bags and go home to her parents. Now that you mention it, though, Lilius murmured, I could speak to them about this, lay the groundwork for you. My God! Of course! It's brilliant! Roxy might not react well if I brought this up out of nowhere, but she was actively learning new bedroom techniques from Lilius. Lilius could easily start dropping a few lessons about threesomes into the curriculum, and Sylphie trusted her advice completely, too. This was perfect, almost too perfect. We'd been wrestling around in bed together in no time, and I wouldn't even have to feel awkward about it. Lilius, you're a goddess! Was that a halo I saw above her head? Overcome with emotion, I bowed deeply before my savior. Lilius replied in an amused tone, Well, such flattery. I'm not sure I actually want to help you, though. It's not like I'm getting anything out of the bargain. Gah! She brought up the idea, and now she was refusing to help me? What a terrible woman. But I couldn't fight back now. She had me on in the palm of her hand, and she knew it. I had all the willpower of a horse with a carrot dangling in front of its nose. Is there anything at all I could do for you, Linelise? As I looked up anxiously at her face, Linelise grinned wickedly. This woman really was a villain. Even my smiles didn't look this evil. Probably. Well, I seem to remember hearing something about a rare aphrodisiac from the kingdom of Asura. Right, I've still got that. Never got around to using it. Would you mind giving that to me as a present? She had to be talking about that little bottle of potion I'd received from Luke. To be honest, I'd never felt the need to rely on that stuff. I had more stamina than either of my wives, so I was afraid I might end up harming them if I took it. The idea of making them take it felt a little wrong, too. I'd never figured out a good way to use it. How do you want to use it? To spice up my wedding night. Is that even going to be necessary? It's a special occasion, dear. I'd like to have Cliff on me like a wild beast all night long. Sometimes it amazed me how freely Linelise embraced her own horniness. I mean, it wasn't like Cliff was constantly walking around in a state of excitement. Delicate question, Linelise, but do you ever get worried that you'll drive Cliff away with your, appetite? Not at all. We wouldn't have ended up together in the first place if he couldn't handle it. Ever considered trying to tone things down for his sake? I could try to restrain myself, but I'd explode eventually. I'd rather be constantly honest about my feelings. That was a Linelise for you, all right. Now that I thought about it, though, Cliff didn't seem to be forcing himself to keep up with her either. He did his best to please her, but I felt like he knew his own limits. They both loved each other intensely in their own distinct ways. That seemed like a fun dynamic for a relationship. I kind of envied them. Well, all right then. You've got a deal. I'll bring it over next time I stop by. You're too kind, dear. Oh, I can't wait to see what Cliff's like when he can't control his passion anymore. Linelise began to drool, her eyes glassy with passion. I was starting to feel a bit worried for my friend, but hopefully the two of them would emerge from this even closer than before. A month later, I found myself in the only Millis church in the city of Sharia. It was a majestic, solemn place, not unlike a Christian cathedral. Rows of simple benches filled most of the space. Up in front, the holy symbol of the Millis faith stood in a pool of sunlight, pouring through a huge glass window, and in front of that symbol, a priest was offering a litany of praise to God. Saint Millis will always guide you and watch over you. A man and a woman stood facing the priest, wearing pure white clothing. Behind them, 20-odd spectators looked on quietly. Should anyone seek to divide you, this holy shield will protect you. Should anyone seek to harm you, his holy sword will judge them. And should your love prove a lie, his fiery sorrow will pierce the heavens. I was one of those spectators, standing in the very first row, in fact, all dressed up in the Asuran-style finery. In Asuran-style finery. Sylphie stood at my right, and Roxy on my left. Both of them wore modest formal dresses. We hadn't owned any of these clothes beforehand, so we'd gone out and bought them for the occasion. I wasn't sure when we'd need to wear them again, but it couldn't hurt to have them around. Ariel and Luke stood on Sylphie's other side, wearing what looked to be some very expensive clothes on their own. Behind us was another row of VIPs, including Zanoba, Lilia, Persenna, and behind them there was a row of miscellaneous guests, Ginger, Julie, and two girls who were apparently Ariel's attendants, among others. I couldn't see them from where I stood, but Norn and Aisha were somewhere back there, too. They were both wearing nice dresses today, too, but I'd opted to rent those. They were both growing girls, so it felt premature to buy anything. They hadn't been too pleased about that, of course. There were some guests I didn't recognize as well, but unsurprisingly, Nanahoshi hadn't shown. In Millis church weddings, the rows of guests were apparently divided by rank. The very front row was reserved for the highest-ranking spectators, as well as the closest family members of the bride and groom. Princess Ariel's presence in the front row was only natural, in other words, and Sylphie was Linelise's only relative in the room, which earned her a spot. On the other hand, I was only up here because I was Sylphie's husband. That made me feel slightly out of place. Roxy had it worse than me, though. She was up here as my second wife, and the Millis church didn't think too highly of bigamy. I think she found the situation a little awkward since she'd been standing stiffly in place since the ceremony began. Luke had said there was no need to be self-conscious since many Asuran nobles took multiple wives despite the doctrines of the church. I didn't think Roxy had anything to feel guilty about either, for the record. As the ceremony moved steadily along, one exchange caught my attention. Cliff Grimmore. Do you swear to love Elinelise Dragonroad, and only her, so long as you both do live? I swear to love her until my death. Apparently, the Millis Church had marriage vows, too, and Cliff's choice of words struck me as really heavy. Knowing him, he'd keep his word on this quite literally. Elinelise would be the only woman he'd touch for the rest of his life. I admired that kind of faithfulness, although I apparently wasn't capable of it myself. Elinelise Dragonroad, do you swear to love Cliff Grimmore, and only him, so long as you both do live? I swear to love him all my life. I wasn't sure what to think of Elinelise's vow, though. I knew she'd try to keep her word, but she had her curse to contend with, and there was also the matter of her lifespan. Cliff was probably going to die before her, and I felt like she'd eventually go looking for someone new to love, and no one could blame her for it, surely. Still, it was kind of bizarre to see her getting married, considering the reason she'd enrolled at the university was sleep around with a bunch of vigorous young men. Life's just full of surprises, isn't it? In that case, the groom may place the necklace of Millis on his bride. Cliff carefully accepted a large, heavily ornamented necklace from the priest. It was a standard ceremonial prop, supposedly made in the image of a necklace St. Millis himself had once worn. Every church had their own copy. Bend over a little, Lise, Cliff whispered under his breath. Ah, right, sorry. Elinelise lowered her head slightly, and Cliff got up on tiptoe to place the necklace around her neck. It wasn't the most graceful moment. Poor guy didn't seem to be getting any taller. And now the bride may give her groom the promissory kiss, said the priest. Of course. Slowly bending over, Elinelise kissed Cliff on his forehead rather than his lips. Okay, gotta say, this looks absolutely adorable. There you are. I can't wait to get here. Season 3, I believe this is happening in Season 3. This is going to be a really cute moment in Season 3. It's going to be weird for some people that Season 3 starts off in a slice of life kind of way. But, you know, it is what it is. This part of the ceremony was based on a story from the life of St. Millis. On the day of his departure for the battlefield, Millis had bestowed his necklace on his most beloved. In return, she kissed him on the forehead, praying as she did so for his safe return. Later, when Millis was in grave danger, his most beloved held up her necklace to the heavens. Moved by its beauty and the depths of her love, God then interceded to save Millis. The story was said to be based on real historical events, but it was hard to say how much of it was literally true. God in heaven, hear my plea. Grant these two the gift of everlasting love and happiness. As he spoke these words, the priest's wooden staff let out a brilliant burst of light that illuminated the entire church. The newlyweds were silhouetted against the radiance. With their pure white clothing, it almost looked as if they were melting into it. It was a lovely, dreamlike moment that seemed to last much longer than it did. Even after the light faded away, Elinelise and Cliff stayed as they were, smiling into each other's faces. They looked truly happy, and it was obvious they were going to stay that way. I almost felt guilty for thinking, so that staff's a magic implement, right? Instead of cooing at the spectacle. Maybe I was getting a little too pragmatic. With the ceremony at an end, the guests filed out of the church while the newlyweds looked on. It was a fairly short event, all things considered. Its purpose was solely to prove their mutual love to God, with us serving as witnesses. There wasn't a reception afterward or anything. Members of the nobility would probably take the opportunity for an after-party, but ultimately Cliff was just a student. Still, if Batty Gaddy had been here, I had a feeling he would have loudly demanded that we throw a feast, and I was kind of in the mood to celebrate myself for once. It was a happy occasion, after all. That was amazing. The bride looked so beautiful. Aisha and Norn were in high spirits as well. They'd been chattering excitedly about the ceremony ever since we left the church. You'd never have guessed that there was any tension between them. Come to think of it, though, I hadn't seen them fighting lately. If anything, they were getting along nicely. Millis weddings are so romantic, aren't they? Yeah, I want to wear a dress like that. As my two sisters chirped away, I glanced over at them furtively. I could see Norn falling in love with someone and putting on her own pure white dress someday. It wasn't the most pleasant of thoughts. I'd have to give the lucky man a punch to the face at his wedding present. as his wedding present. Aisha, though, I wasn't sure about her. It was difficult to imagine her running off to get married. Maybe she'd spend her whole life as the family maid. I guess girls do dream about that sort of ceremony, huh? I said, turning to Sylphie. Sure, I'm not complaining, though, she answered with a smile. Ours was nice in its own way. I liked how intimate it was. Of course, if she wanted her own wedding ceremony, we could manage something similar. We weren't members of the Millis Church, though, so it would be more of an imitation than anything else. Cliff would probably agree to officiate if I got down on my knees and begged him. I would hesitate to grovel for Sylphie's sake, either. A good man puts his wife before his dignity. Oh, I wouldn't. Sorry. A good man puts his wife before his dignity. Yeah, right? Someone had tugged silently at my sleeve. I turned to find Roxy looking up at me. She put on some makeup for the occasion, which only enhanced her beauty. The blush on her cheeks looked to be purely natural, though. Do you want to have a wedding ceremony of your own, Roxy? The two of us had never gotten around to formally celebrating our marriage. The timing had a lot to do with it. We just delivered the news of Paul's death, after all. But in addition to that, the Meagard had no tradition of matrimonial ceremonies. Roxy had told me up front that it wouldn't be necessary. Still, it wouldn't have surprised me if she'd changed her mind after today. No, that won't be necessary, but, try to read between the lines, will you? With that, Roxy closed her eyes and puckered up. I wasn't entirely sure what had prompted this, but I wasn't about to pass up on such a delightful invitation. Taking Roxy by the shoulders, I pulled her close and kissed her on the forehead. What? Sorry about that. Your forehead's particularly adorable today. Is it? Hee hee. Roxy seemed a bit confused at first, probably because of where I'd planted my kiss. But once I complimented her, a big goofy smile spread across her face. The woman was truly easy to manipulate, but that was just another part of what made her charming. Okay, I think I've made up my mind. It has to be Roxy tonight. Oh, Rudy, give me one of those. Clinging to my right arm, Sylphie pushed her head toward me expectantly. Naturally, I wasn't about to disappoint her. Why would I hesitate to plant a kiss on a beautiful woman's forehead? Hee 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 hee. Despite the fact that she'd initiated the kiss, Sylphie pressed her hand to her forehead and giggled bashfully. Does she have to be so cute all the time? God, now I want to sleep with her tonight, but also Roxy. What about both of them at once? I wasn't sure if Elise had finished laying the groundwork for me yet. It had been a while since I asked her, though, and I'd given her the aphrodisiac some time ago. Maybe it was safe to give this a shot. Rudius, could you try to control yourself? Said Norn, interrupting my leering session. We're in public. The look on her face clearly conveyed the unspoken part of her message. I just saw a very nice wedding, but your degeneracy is kind of killing the mood. I understood how she felt. It's not much fun watching your brother seducing a woman, let alone two of them at once. Aw, is somebody a whittle jealous? What the? God, quit it! By ways of an apology, I gave Norn a big hug and planted a kiss on her forehead. Blushing, she pulled herself away and started rubbing furiously at the spot where my lips had touched her. What a splendid sight. Aisha took all of this with an extremely envious look on her face. It was obvious she wanted to be included, but feared that I might turn her down. Not that she had any reason to be worried, of course. Aisha! With my best attempt at a warm, loving smile, I turned to her and spread my arms wide. Rudius! Her face shining with joy, Aisha leapt toward me. After receiving her forehead kiss, she snuggled against me like a happy cat. Wah! Come, suffer in my embrace. Still, I couldn't say I approved of her twinning her legs around mine like this in public. She was wearing a dress and all, so she was probably exposing her underwear. Aisha, cut it out with your legs. You've got a dress on, remember? I'm assuming you don't want to flash everyone on the street. Okay, got it. Hopping away from me with a satisfied grin, Aisha got right back to trotting down the street. What was I gonna do with her? True, she was only 11 years old, which made her a child, but sadly there are some gentlemen out there who regard anyone over the age of 10 as fair game. I needed her to be more careful. As I set off after my sister, a stray thought popped into my head. In a letter he wrote some time ago, Paul had suggested that we celebrate once our family was reunited. I'd been meaning to do something along those lines, but somehow 6 months had slipped past without it happening. We hadn't held a party for Aisha and Norn on their 5th or 10th birthdays either. I felt guilty about that, especially since I'd been treated to a big bash at their age. It's always nice to have someone celebrate for you, right? Yeah, okay. Let's have us a party. Legends of the University number 7. The boss is a big shot. All right. Here's the thing. I'm going to skip the exercises this time so we can get done with this chapter 8. And I don't have to spend like forever trying to gather my breath. So we're just going to run through that. Whatever exercises we have that have been unfulfilled, we can continue those on. So if we're at a full house, great. Don't send any more exercises. If we're not at a full house, then send what exercises need to remain. That's it. Let's move on. Chapter 8, A Lucky Man. One day, about 2 weeks after Cliff's marriage to Elinalise, I headed out into town with both Sylphie and Roxy. Our goal for the day was to purchase birthday presents for Norn and Aisha. I decided to make their party a surprise, which meant we needed to make all the preparations as stealthy as possible. There was another reason why I dragged both my wives along on this trip, but we'll get to that later. We were in the middle of the harvest season by now, and the city was bustling with activity. Horse-drawn carriages were rumbling along the streets in all directions, and the vendors selling fruits and vegetables were all smiles. The food was cheaper at this time of year, but also fresher and tastier. The Harvest Festival was coming up soon, too, as evidenced by the big wooden stage that had gone up in the middle of the city's central square. This wasn't the most elaborate of events. It involved campfires in the streets, big pots of stew with all sorts of ingredients, and a lot of cheap booze. People would gather around the fires to eat, drink, and express their gratitude for the earth's blessings. There weren't any other major events that I knew of, no singing or dancing even. Still, as long as you brought your own pot, you could get a big helping of the stew for free. Aisha had apparently taken advantage of this last year while I was away. She hadn't been too impressed, though. They sort of threw things in there at random, so the flavor wasn't anything to write home about. Hopefully I'd get the chance to try it for myself this year. If it was gross, that might be interesting in its own way. It's certainly lively these days, said Roxy, looking around curiously. Yeah, it always is, said Sylphie. Lots of people come into town this time of year. Apart from the merchants moving in all directions, there were plenty of students out on the streets, peering into into booths and stalls. Sometimes we passed farmers pushing wheelbarrows full of vegetables, and adventurers squabbling about who'd bumped whose shoulder. Shari was the biggest city in all of this region, but it was only this noisy around this time of year. Also, I was noticing an unusual number of beast folk out in the streets. Most of them were tough-looking guys carrying broad machete-like swords. They had a festival of their own going at the moment, as it happened. Lenny and Persina were both going into heat around the same time, so their bravest young fighters had traveled here from all around the world to compete for them. This year, Lenny and Persina were going to be facing them head-on. I guess they thought it was about time to find themselves husbands. In a break with beastfolk traditions, however, they declared that they would be choosing their mates personally from among those who bested them. At a bare minimum, they wanted a sword saint, advanced tier mage, or A-rank adventurer. Furthermore, his fur needed to be glossy, his ears erect, and his tail straight. Oh, and he had to be both a savage warrior and a considerate gentleman. Their standards seemed to be unrealistic to me, to be perfectly honest. They're kind of basing most of this shit around you, buddy. Hopefully they'd find someone nice. Just like me. Oh, on my right, I had Sylphie. On my left, I had Roxy. A woman on both sides. Every man's dream. Hey there, Miss Sylphiette, Miss Roxy. I got a proposal for you. And what would that be, Mr. Rudius? Oh. Jesus Christ, I did that wrong. I thought it was a merchant calling out at them. Hey there, Miss Sylphiette, Miss Roxy. I've got a proposal for you. And what might that be, Mr. Rudius? Go right ahead. How about we walk arm in arm? The idea popped into my head suddenly, but it was sort of an extension of my previous thought. The real dream was to strut around with two women clinging to your arms, showing off how popular you were. I'd seen a few men like that in my previous life, and it always made me want to puke, but deep down inside, I wanted to be one of them. I wanted to do what they could do. Okay, sure. Sylphie immediately grabbed my right arm. Roxy hesitated slightly, then took my left. The day had come, at least. I was risen! Now it was my turn to endure people's jealous gazes! Ah, and how wonderful it felt! Looking around the area, though, I realized that the merchants were busy with their own affairs. The beastfolk warriors were hurrying off to the university. Some of the students in the crowd were looking our way, but they averted their eyes quickly. I might have gotten a few jeers from the local adventurers if we were in a tavern or something, but even they didn't seem bored enough to harass me on the street. Overall, I was getting much less attention than I'd anticipated. Still, I was deeply... Really? Still, I was deeply satisfied with the experience. Why, you might ask? Well, my right arm was currently experiencing some pleasant sensations. Sylphie was pressing a certain something against it. In her way, it wasn't capable of... in a way, it wasn't capable of before. No need to be coy, right? I'm referring to her chest. I, Rudius Greyrat, was walking through town with a woman's breast pushing up against my arm. The simple fact was enough to fill me with joy. The once barren soil of my heart, bleached dry by a miserable adolescence, was blooming with life. I couldn't stay in this oasis forever. Soon enough, those pillowy clouds of pleasure would return to their rightful and more modest size. But that didn't make them any less real. They were the legendary treasure islands, and I had found them. And it wasn't just Sylphie offering me this joy. Roxy on my left was also pressing her meager chest against me. Her breasts were small, but they did exist. I could feel their distinct softness against the muscles of my arm. They were meek enough to inherit the earth. This was truly splendid. I said a few silent words of thanks to the muscles of my own arms, if not for their hardness, I couldn't have appreciated the softness so fully. Ha ha! Don't be jealous, Hercules the Bicep. You're truly wonderful as well. I hadn't meant to laugh like that, but it had happened anyway. As I've already mentioned, the purpose of our outing today was to choose presents for my dear little sisters. However, that wasn't my only goal. Just the other day, Lilius had finally delivered the news that I'd been waiting to hear. I've softened them both up for you, Rudius. You just take them both out on a date, get a nice mood going, and then take them to a classy inn. That's right, my friends. Today was the day. I was going to sleep with both my wives at once. I was boiling with anticipation. Would I be able to satisfy them both? I couldn't wait to try. Rudy? Rudy? Sylphie's voice snapped me back to reality. Whoops, guess I was zoning out a bit there. You're drooling, said Roxy, wiping my face with her handkerchief. Are you ready to eat already? I clearly needed to be a bit more attentive. I was hoping today would end with a threesome, yes, but I wasn't going to get sloppy about the date itself. We'd picked out Norn and Aisha's presents carefully, and after that I was going to make sure they both enjoyed their day out. All this was equally important. Sorry about that, I said with a smile, renewing my focus on the tasks in hand. I guess I was just lost in thought. Picking the presents was our main activity for the day. We decided to look all around the city and take our time with the decision. Our search got underway in the workshop district. You could find all sorts of magical tools and implements in this area of the city. Of course, there were plenty of enchanted objects for sale in the commerce district as well, but those were largely tested, refined products that commanded very high prices. In the workshop district, you got a more eclectic mix, including prototypes and experiments produced by fledgling creators. For the most part, their effects weren't too remarkable. They were more like toys than anything else, but sometimes you'd dig through a pile of junk and find a masterpiece from an inventor who'd soon be famous. Or so Roxy told me, at least. One of her old classmates from the university had joined a workshop here as an apprentice, so she knew a few things about the area. Unfortunately, they'd moved to a different city at some point. Roxy didn't seem too optimistic about our mission. To be honest, I don't think we'll find anything those two would like here, she said, but she was browsing through the magical implements on display with great interest. Naturally, I wasn't expecting to find a suitable present for Norn and Aisha either. The reason I'd brought us here was to find a gift for Roxy. Although we were formally married, I'd never really celebrated that with her. She wasn't interested in a wedding ceremony, but we could still have a belated party. My plan was to combine that event with Aisha and Norn's birthday celebration. Roxy didn't know about that part, of course. It was also a surprise. She thought she was in on the game, but I was playing five-dimensional chess here. If she expressed interest in anything on sale here, I planned to sneak back out and buy it a few days later. Of course, magical implements could get very expensive. Right now, our family's funding was coming from from four main sources: Sylphie and Roxy's salaries, the royalties from that scroll Nanahoshi gave me, and the money we'd earned from that labyrinth. In particular, the labyrinth money, my inheritance from Paul, in a sense, could have kept me comfortable for a solid 30 years, or so all on his own. It wasn't enough to let me lounge around for the rest of my life, but it was a very nice cushion. There was no telling when we might need to spend a whole lot of money all at once, so I was doing my best not to spend our cash carelessly. For a wedding present, though, I was more than willing to dip into my savings. Hell, if Roxy muttered, "I want to drive a Porsche," I'd get her one. There didn't seem to be any luxury car dealers in the magic city of Sharia, though, so I might have to settle for drawing their logo on Dillo's forehead. That's funny. This pot that freezes its contents when you feed it mana seems handy. Maybe Aisha would appreciate it. I get the feeling Aisha prefers cute things, honestly. Oh, you're right. I guess we shouldn't give her something she'd use at work. I watched Roxy like a hawk as she chatted with Sylphie. So far, I hadn't noticed her yearning for anything in particular. She seemed totally focused on picking a present for my sisters rather than finding something for herself. What do you think, Rudy? I think it would be delightful to lick your face like a dog, Roxy. Can you try to take this seriously? You're the one who suggested this trip, you know. Of course, I was thinking about Aisha and Norn's presents as well, but the stuff for sale here just wasn't their style. After a while, we moved to the Commerce District. Our destination was Sylphie's favorite clothing store. I bought my current robe here, and it was my go-to place for finding presents. Also, wow, you shop at some very fancy stores, I see. Roxy hesitated a little outside the shop, then looked down at her own robe with an uncertain expression. Should I be telling her there wasn't a dress code, maybe? Huh, said Sylphie. Is it really that fancy? She seemed genuinely nonplussed. As a general rule, she only bought her clothes at fairly expensive establishments. It wasn't like Sylphie was careless with her money or anything. She just spent many years accompanying Ariel. You tend to pick up on the shopping habits of your closest friends, I guess. I was sure she understood this place was expensive in some sense. It probably just seemed like the best option among the stores she was familiar with. Fancy is a relative term, after all. Well, no, I suppose the Grey Rat family can afford to shop here. It's just, I don't usually visit stores this nice myself, personally. I guess it is kind of fancy, then? Sylphie said in a crestfallen tone, her ears drooping slightly. Rudy, I'm not spending too much money, am I? Don't worry, Sylphie, you're fine. Apart from anything else, she paid for the clothes she bought out of her own salary. I didn't have any right to complain about how she spent her money. I really wasn't trying to imply that, said Roxy. I shopped at stores like this myself back when I was a royal magician in Sharon, and it seemed like a perfect place to find something special for a birthday present. Oh yeah, right. It is a special occasion. So yeah, that's my teacher for you. She knows when to switch to the offensive. Better follow that up. You know, I don't think there's anything wrong with you buying some pricey clothes, really. Buying yourself some pricey clothes, really, I said with a smile. Sylphie pouted at this. So you do think they're pricey after all? Slip of the tongue. I meant stylish clothes. Should we go somewhere else after all? The only other stores I know are even more expensive, though. That won't be necessary. Let's buy something here. Originally, Sylphie had barely owned any personal outfits at all. She'd started dressing up for me. I had no reason to complain about that, to say the least. This place was kind of pricey, but by my personal standards, yes. But that was just because I'd gotten used to buying cheap stuff in my years as a wandering adventurer. I was willing to adjust my standards upwards, as long as we could still afford it, at least. The moment we stepped inside the store, an employee trotted over to greet us. I guess they made a habit of remembering their regulars in places like this. Well, if it isn't the Grey Rats. It's so very nice to have you back in our establishment. What can we do for you today? Oh, we're just browsing, I said, looking to buy presents for 2 children, both about 10 years old. I see. Why don't you come this way, then? Instantly, the clerk led us to a section of the store totally occupied by children's clothing. They train their employees well here, from the looks of things. The kids section wasn't any less fancy than the rest of the place. They had a wide range of outfits on display, including everything from casual wear to robes and dresses. Your 10th birthday was considered a very big deal, so people probably bought a lot of formal wear for kids around that age. My goodness, there are a lot of different styles. I'm not even sure how to start. Well, it's going to be winter soon, right? Maybe something warm would be good. Roxy and Sylphie started looking through the outfits immediately. It sounded like they were enjoying themselves. Quite a contrast with a certain redhead whose entire attitude toward clothing was, anything's fine. What do you think, Rudy? Asked Sylphie, turning back to me. Well, Norn's winter coat is getting a little small on her. She might be looking for a new one, I offered. The two of them nodded thoughtfully. Okay, maybe a coat for her then. But what should we do for Aisha? Oh, she was complaining the other day that her shoes are getting tight, said Roxy. New shoes! That sounds good. Let's see what we can find. Having narrowed our focus down considerably, we started browsing through the goods in earnest. Thanks to all the different options and offer, it didn't take long to find gifts that fit my sister's personal styles. For Norn, we settled on a brightly colored coat. Where did my fucking tongue go on that sentence? For Norn, we settled on a brightly colored coat. For Aisha, we picked out a pair of boots with a nicely stitched flower pattern. They were both sized a bit large, but it didn't seem like a problem. My sisters were both growing girls, after all. With our main job accomplished, we took some time to wander aimlessly around the store. It wasn't like we had to limit ourselves to a single present, and more importantly, I was still looking for a perfect gift for Roxy, although I kept that part to myself, of course. These cloth corsages are nice. I wonder if Aisha would like them, I said, studying a basket of intricate little bouquets. Maybe. She does love flowers, said Sylphie. Yeah, I'm not sure if a kid would appreciate that sort of thing, though. Come to think of it, I don't really know what sort of things Norn likes. Good question. She doesn't talk about her taste that often, not around me at least. Norn has somewhat boyish tastes, I think, said Roxy. She likes swords, armor, horses, that sort of thing. Wait, really? How do you know that? Well, I've been trying to get to know her better, so... Roxy abruptly stopped in her tracks, trailing off mid-sentence. Her eyes were fixed on a certain outfit. It was a magician's robe, complete with hat, displayed prominently on a nearby stand. The robe was in an adult male's size, so there was no chance it would fit her. Still, she stared intently at it, more specifically, at the hat. After a moment, she shook off her own hat and began to study it with conflicted expression. It was clearly an old hat at this point. I had a feeling it was the very same one she'd worn as my tutor back in Buena Village. It wasn't exactly falling apart at the seams, but its black coloring hid some of the wear and tear. But you could tell it had been through its share of battles. After putting her hat back on, Roxy gingerly stretched up to her full height and took the other one from its stand. She spun it around, finding a price tag, and grimaced. An instant later, she put it right back where it came from. Apparently it wasn't cheap. With an audible sigh, she turned to rejoin us. It was clear she'd already pushed the matter out of her mind. Hey, Rudy? Sylphie had sidled up to me at some point. Let's go with that. Sounds good. It seemed we'd both had the same thought. We'd found Roxy's present. A little while later, we ordered Norn's coat and Aisha's boots and left the store. I'd also secretly bought the hat for Roxy. We'd been picking up the goods on the day of the party itself. The store promised to wrap everything up for us. Fortunately, I was starting to really look forward to it. Finally, the three of us headed to the lodging district, where many of the local adventurers congregated. We'd been wandering across the city at a leisurely pace, so it was already early evening. This was about the time of day when adventurers would return from the labyrinth explorations, bearing new prizes. It was also the time of day when parties running low on funds would start selling off their goods to replenish their cash reserves. Sometimes you could stumble onto a great deal if you knew what you were doing. Still, magic items were always on the pricey side, and we honestly didn't have much need for them. This was more of a window shopping expedition. Or so I'd thought going in, at least. See, Sylphie, this is the kind of thing adventurers wear. Most people buy stuff like this when they need an outfit. Okay, I get it, but I don't wear stuff like this too often, you know? I'm not sure if it's going to work for me. I think this would suit you, Sylphie. You're quite slender, so capes look good on you. Carried away by our conversation, we ended up buying Sylphie a whole new set of clothes. It was kind of a outfit a mage knight might wear, complete with elbow guards. It wasn't exactly elegant, but it made her look like a novice adventurer, which I found painfully adorable. Now Sylphie could go off on an adventure anytime she wanted. Not that she really needed to, or could, given her job. When she was working, Sylphie usually wore a set of powerful magic items. She probably wouldn't get many chances to wear this. Hee. Thanks, guys. Still, she looked very pleased with the gift. By the way, by the time we were finished with our purchases, the stores in the area were starting to close. Shops didn't stay open all night, as a general rule. We spontaneously headed toward the nearest taverns and restaurants. Well, it felt spontaneous to Sylphie and Roxy, at least. This was all going according to plan. Just according to cake. I'd actually made reservations in advance, anticipating this situation. We'd be eating at an inn targeted at S-rank adventurers. Elena-Lise had recommended it to me as the perfect place to finish off a date. The food was good, the atmosphere was nice, the beds were big, and the rooms were nearly soundproof. Oh, I know this place. Grandma told me to take you here if we ever needed to make up after a fight. You too, Sylphie? She said the same thing to me. To my surprise, both of my wives recognized the name of the place. At the end of the day, it seemed we were all just pawns in Elena-Lise's game. Well, whatever. It's no big deal if they've heard of it. Elena-Lise mentioned something else to me, actually, continued Roxy. She said Rudy might take both of us here at some point, with the intent of, well, you know. Yeah, she said that to me too. So that's what this was all about. Honestly, what are we going to do with you, Rudy? Sylphie and Roxy looked over at me with narrowed eyes. However, I didn't see any real disgust or shock in their faces. Elena-Lise had done her job well. They seemed receptive to my plan. I owed that woman big time. Thank you, Elena-Lise. You're the best, Elena-Lise. Still, you didn't mention we'd be spending the night. I'm a little worried about Lucy. The objection was reasonable enough, but of course I hadn't overlooked that little detail either. Don't worry, Sylphie. I entrusted her with Lilia for tonight. When I explained the situation, she nodded seriously and promised me her full support. It was always nice to have dependable allies. It still feels a little wrong of us, but at least she's in good hands, I guess. Sylphie seemed to think at least one of us should be with our child every night. A very understandable perspective, but I won't make any excuses for myself. Sorry, Lucy. I do love you, okay? Forgive your wicked, lustful father. Roxy piped up next. I do have school tomorrow, you know. Her job was important, of course, but this wouldn't be an issue either. We'll just wake up early and head back to the house before you need to leave. You think we'll be able to wake up early? I'm not sure I will. This is always exhausting for me. Don't worry, Roxy. I've got it. Well, if you say so, Rudy. Whew. It had taken a bit more convincing than I'd expected, but I'd gotten both of their approval. All right then, dear. Be gentle with us. We'll do our best. Seeing my adorable wives bowing their heads to me, I was ready to get right down to business. Of course, heading straight to bed wouldn't have been proper. We needed to have a nice meal, get a bit tipsy, and whisper some loving words to each other first. You've got to set the mood, you know? Accordingly, we started things off with dinner at the restaurant that occupied the first floor of the inn. The food here was very good in its own right, after all. I wanted to make sure they both understood that lust wasn't the only thing I felt toward them. It was there, of course, but I also loved just spending time with them. When both of them were in the room at once, each of them could only get half the love that I could show them individually. I intended to compensate for that through a sheer effort. Wow, this looks incredible. I don't think I've ever seen a meal like this too often. As plate after plate of food was delivered to our table, Roxy and Sylphie's eyes went wide with amazement. In the northern territories, raw ingredients were expensive and hard to buy in bulk, which meant ordinary meals tended to be a little meager. Pardon me. But this was a season where food was most plentiful, and we were also in a very expensive restaurant. Among other things, we had a huge bowl of salad full of fresh, juicy vegetables, a spicy soup packed with freshwater fish, and a glistening, well-seasoned black and blue steak. None of it was the sort of stuff you got to eat very often in these parts. In addition, the meal had come with a bottle of whiskey-like liquor with a rich aroma. Soup is delicious. I wonder how they seasoned it. Maybe oil infused with mustard? Sophie wasn't touching the alcohol, probably because of Lucy. She was entranced by the soup, though, and kept taking additional servings. I should see if I can find a recipe. Rudy, would you try it if I made some? She tilted her head at me in a particularly adorable way as she asked this question. It really stoked my appetite, if you know what I mean. I'll gobble it all down and then have you as a side dish. Oh, come on, Rudy. Finally, we had dessert. It was actually a standard part of the meal at this place. Still, their offering wasn't exactly comparable to the more complex cakes and sweets you'd find in a place like the holy country of Millis. It mainly consisted of fruits that looked a lot like apples. I'd eaten these before, but they were much sourer than apples from my old world. At this restaurant, however, they chopped them up into bite-sized chunks for you and immersed them in a gooey honey-like syrup. It tasted something like a candied apple, or maybe a thicker variety of fruit punch. I was surprised by how much I enjoyed it. I would have expected apples and honey to taste more like sweet Japanese curry, but apparently I was mistaken. This is incredible. Roxy was particularly pleased with the treat. Her eyes shining with excitement, she shoveled it rapidly into her mouth. It seemed my dear teacher had something of a sweet tooth. Either that or the Meagard tribe had an ingrained preference for sugar. It's so good! I didn't know you could get anything like this in the Northern Territories. Either way, the joy in her face was very real. I was starting to worry she might have an explosive foodgasm in the middle of the restaurant. Oh! All too quickly, her dessert had disappeared. She stared down at her empty plate regretfully. Here, Roxy, you can have mine. As I pushed my share over to her, Roxy looked at me in shock. Really? Are you sure? I'd been enjoying the dessert myself, of course, but I enjoyed seeing that look of pure delight on her face even more. Yeah, I'm sure. Here, say, ah. I'm not a child, you know. Ah. She did it anyway. Grandma 6D chess, oh God. With every bite I fed her, Roxy's face lit up, and she held her hand to her cheek in bliss. It made me want to keep going indefinitely, but sadly my share of the dessert had disappeared as well. We'd have to continue this the next time we came here. Okay then. We've had a nice dinner, and I've softened them up with sweets. I think it's about time. You know, ladies, what is it, Rudy? Go ahead. I've actually reserved a room here as it happens. Ah, this feels good. This was another line I wanted to say at least once. Right. Roxy, I know we talked about this, but, are you sure you're okay doing this with me? Yes, I think I'm ready for this. Let's do it. Roxy and Sylphie nodded to each other, blushing slightly. This was going to be a night to remember. Legends of the University, number 8. The boss is loaded. And that's it, gang. That's all 8 chapters down. I still have 20 minutes left, which means we can get those exercises out of the way. Where are we at? Where are we at? I know that we are full on, I think, squats, right? 2 more heel touches, planks, and jumping jacks. So we got heel touches, planks, and jumping jacks. So we're at 30 of those, and then I guess 40 of everything else. Let's just get the let's just get the 30s out of the way, and I'll do all the 40s. Oh, okay. Well, there's all the things. Okay, cool. So 30 jumping jacks. Let's get it. Let's get it on. Okay, I just realized something that I should have thought about a while ago. If you're over on YouTube, thank you so much for coming by and checking out the light novel readings for chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8. Really, really appreciate it. But I'm going to go ahead and cut this off here. I want to make sure that there is something that the Twitch viewers get that's a little extra. So my exercises and the aftermath and just chatting with them is going to be part of that. So if you'd like to come by and check these out live, you can do so. The Twitch link is down in the description on all of our YouTube videos. And of course, thank you so much to everybody that comes through on these videos and goes through and checks the chapters and all that stuff. I appreciate that. Helps me put the chapters together. Really, really appreciate it. But if you do me a favor and leave a like and a comment so that the activity on these videos goes up, and that, you know, it makes it easier for the channel to grow. So thank you very much for that. And even if you stop by on Twitch, if you just want to put it on in the background and re-listen, that's cool too. Thank you guys so much for coming by. Really appreciate it. And we'll see you on the next one. Take care and bye-bye for now, all of you on YouTube.